These folks talk about the Denmark strain that came from the zoologists, from minks getting infected from humans and then reinfecting humans. Why Denmark killed off all their stuff, their minks, but yet somehow those minks were sent to America. Infected minks in a mink farm in Oregon. And somehow in Utah. And this is all back in November, December, folks. That strain that they keep saying is California's, that's a Denmark strain, L452R, from the minks. They found in wild minks in Utah, and there's the explosion of shit going on the East Coast. What's crazy is the similarity of the 501V2 escape mutation along with the binder sites of being able to get to their ACE2 receptor. It's able to bind more easily besides grappling and binding onto the other sites that are in the same pathogenic way of it getting to the epidermis and latching on the epithelial cells like it does with how AIDS binds and so forth to its host cell. And what's interesting is they keep trying to say that it's genetic convergence, and I keep saying, you super fucks, it's motherfucking the Key Space program, and motherfuckers working with this shit because they've been breeding it. That's why you keep seeing viremia of H1N1, H5N1, H2N1, the swine flu, bird flu, and this other weird ass shit, the Hintha stuff, and Ebola, SARS, Dinga, MERS, they're all being bred. And as you see, caseloads have gone down around the world. It needs to be seen as, are these mutations that are spiking in areas, are they from them doing vaccine trials? What's the correlation between them? So on and so forth. What do you do?
Thank you.
Only thing I can find right here recent
Thank you.
that has anything to do with.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this U.S. Food and Drug Administration media briefing on a suite of guidances issued today that address virus variants of SARS-CoV-2 and the development of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. The press release on today's announcement has been posted to the FDA's website. I am Shannon P. Hatch with the FDA's Office of Media Affairs. In a moment, I will turn it over to Acting FDA Commissioner, Dr. Janet Woodcock, for opening remarks. After the remarks, we will then move to the question and answer portion of the call. For that portion of the call, Dr. Woodcock will be joined by Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni, Acting Director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Dr. Peter Marks, Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and Dr. Jeff Shuren, Director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Reporters on the phone will be in a listen-only mode until we open the call up for questions. As a reminder, this audio call is being recorded and live streamed on FDA's YouTube channel. When asking a question, please state your name and affiliation. Also, please ensure questions pertain to today's announcement and limit yourself to one question and one follow-up question so that we can get to as many as possible. With that, I will now turn the call over to Acting FDA Commissioner, Dr. Janet Woodcock.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you all for joining us. Today, the FDA issued guidances for medical product developers who are developing COVID-19 products, including vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And the purpose of these guidances is to address the emergence and potential future emergence of variants of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And the reason for these guidances is any of these products might be impacted by changes to the virus, particularly their efficacy or their performance. And therefore, we need to identify efficient ways to modify the products that are either in the pipeline or are EUA products to address these variants We also need to make sure that the products that are marketed under EUA or actually marketed are monitored to make sure that if their performance is altered, we know about it and the manufacturers know about it right away. The FDA has anticipated the possible emergence of variants, and we have been prepared to address this issue because we have experience with the other evolving infectious diseases such as influenza and, of course, the chronic viral infection, HIV. Now, we recognize we're in a pandemic situation, and we need to make sure that the healthcare providers have the best available diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines to fight the virus, and that these may need to be modified over time to remain maximally effective. We also know that to contain the virus, we're going to have to contain it around the world. The virus, wherever it is replicating, it is mutating. And so as long as there's a large amount of infection going around the world, probably additional virus variants will emerge. We need a global approach to this global pandemic. And we just like the public to know we're going to use every tool in our toolbox to fight the pandemic, including modifications and pivoting as the virus adapts. We want to get ahead of it, and we remain committed to getting the products out there, even in the face of virus changes. So I'm sure you have more specific questions about each of the guidances, but I'll take a moment to touch on them at a high level. The FDA has already been communicating with the individual medical product sponsors to provide information and scientific advice as they evaluate the impact of these variants on their products. But we want to publish draft guidances, both for transparency and to enable scientific input from various parties so that we have the best possible advice on how to deal with this. One of the guidances issued today is for vaccine development. Of course, this will gain a lot of attention. This includes vaccines that have already received an emergency use authorization, and they may seek to amend their authorization to address additional variants. At this time, as you know, available data suggests the FDA-authorized vaccines are effective in protecting the American public against circulating strains of SARS-CoV-2. However, if there's an emergent variant in the United States that are moderately or fully resistant to the antibody response elicited by the current generation of COVID-19 vaccines, it may be necessary to modify the vaccines or the vaccination regimen. Another guidance issued today provides information on evaluating the potential impact of genetic mutations on COVID-19 tests, including how to monitor for impacts on test performance. There's a lot of tests out there, and we need the manufacturers to be vigilant and make sure that their tests are not impacted adversely by changes to the virus. And the guidance also discusses design considerations for making tests more robust against changes in the virus, because there are ways to do that. FDA has already issued a safety alert to caution that the presence of virus variants in a patient sample can potentially change the performance of a diagnostic test. The FDA had identified a few tests that are known to be impacted by emerging viral mutations, although at this time the impact does not appear to be significant. But it simply illustrates the fact that this can happen. And finally, the FDA is issuing two guidances today regarding variants and development of therapeutics and monoclonal antibody treatments in particular. Now, as you know, monoclonal antibodies are laboratory-made proteins that mimic the immune system in fighting off harmful pathogens such as viruses. We know that some of the monoclonal antibodies that are currently authorized are less active against some of the SARS-CoV-2 variants that have emerged and are prevalent in some parts of the world. So today we're outlining recommendations on efficient approaches to the generation of non-clinical, clinical, and chemistry manufacturing controls data to support an emergency use authorization for monoclonal antibody products that neutralize specific variants. And fortunately, there are a lot of monoclonals in the pipeline. We have a lot of ways we can fairly easily understand their performance against different variants. So we have a lot of prior knowledge about this to work on. The second therapeutics guidance is a revision to our guidance issued last May for drugs and biological products under development to treat or prevent COVID-19, and it provides recommendation regarding phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, including patient population, trial design, efficacy endpoints, safety considerations, and the statistical analysis for such trials, and more. And we have updated this guidance since a lot has happened over the last months to address the evolving landscape of COVID-19 drug development, including the emergence of variants and the availability of authorized COVID-19 vaccines. So with these guidances, the FDA is encouraging developers of drugs and biological products to continuously monitor genomic databases for the emerging variants and evaluate potentially prevalent variants circulating in the United States for impact on product performance, and ones outside the United States to be aware of as they may end up here and circulate. And we will do this as well. We will continuously monitor the situation, update our plans as more information becomes available. We are developing scenario planning so that we can respond to whatever contingency arises. And we're committed to communicating with the public as we determine the best path forward. We urge all Americans to continue to get tested, get their vaccines when available, and to follow important health measures such as hand washing, masking, and social distancing. And so before we begin the Q&A portion, I'd like to take a moment to thank the FDA staff who developed these guidances and who are continually monitoring the scientific evidence in the evolving COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd also like to recognize FDA leaders, Dr. Cavazzoni, Marks, and Shuren, who are joining me on this call today and who've been working really tirelessly for the last year. Thank you. And now I'll turn back to the moderator to begin the Q&A.
Guidance. Okay, what variant and what guidance per
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock.
are you guys going to talk about?
So at this time, we'll begin the question and answer portion of the briefing. As a reminder, the call is being recorded and broadcast on YouTube, on the FDA's YouTube channel. When asking a question, please state your name and affiliation. Also, please ensure questions pertain to today's announcement and limit yourself to one question and one follow-up question so we can get to as many as possible. Operator, we'll take the first question.
Thank you. Our first question comes from David Lamb. Your line is open.
Diagnostics Director Tim Stencil on February 3rd said on an industry call that a previously mentioned plan to have CDC help evaluate antigen tests that are already on the market might be difficult to operationalize due to the demands on the CDC, and mentioned that he hoped that BEI may be able to provide inactivated virus material for testing performance of those antigen tests, but said that might take some time. Could you, in light of the guidance today, update us on when the public can expect FDA to share its understanding of how antigen tests on the market are potentially being impacted by the variants? And is it realistic to expect that manufacturers are going to be capable of assessing the impact of variants on the performance of their tests?
Thanks for that question. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Shuren for a response.
So thank you for the question. We've been looking at a number of ways for assessing antigen tests, including for in silico modeling. And that is one method, in addition to assessing antigen tests against viral genetic material. Of course, assessing antigens tests is a little bit more challenging than some of the moleculars. You're looking at proteins on the outside of a virus, and the test itself uses antibodies to then latch onto those proteins. If there's a change in the SARS-CoV-2 genetic genome because of mutation or mutations, it can impact potentially proteins, and if it changes a protein that an antigen test is using, the antibody in that test may not latch into the protein. So modeling may be one method, using genetic material is another, and we are working with other parties on methods to best assess them and hope to have information out soon. We have been, in terms of your questions, can manufacturers go ahead and assess their tests? The answer is yes. In fact, we ourselves have been monitoring for the impact of mutations on molecular tests throughout the pandemic, looking at publicly available databases, and as mutations arise, and particularly as they may become more prevalent, doing computational modeling in our own databases of those tests. And then where there could be an impact, we've been working with developers of those tests to then assess if in fact performance has been impacted. And that informed the alert, the safety alert that Dr. Woodcock talked about, that we issued on January 3rd, about 3 tests that could be impacted by circulating variants. But again, at this time, we do not see a significant impact on performance.
On billboards.
Great, thank you.
Again, it's not.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Oh, this is Janet Woodcock. We are working with CBER, we meaning the operation of the federal government at the HHS level, and we on pseudovirus assays for the neutralizing antibodies for the therapeutics, and we constructed a large number of pseudoviruses, and we seem to get very useful signals from that. So that could be potentially another way to look at antibodies. It wouldn't reflect all parts of test performance, however, unfortunately. Thanks.
So would the public have confidence that antigen tests can be used in expectation with the label indication so far?
Dr. Shurin?
Yes, at the present time, we haven't seen any signals for adverse impact, because that's another thing we do. We continue to monitor if there are changes in test performance, but at the present time, we have not seen any such signs.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Shurin. Operator, we'll take the next question, please.
Our next question comes from Mike Ehrman. Your line is open.
What you expect the size of the trials would need to be, the immunogenicity trials for the new vaccine variants, and also how long you'd expect they might take to conduct?
It's for life, my nigga.
Thank you. I'll turn this over to Dr. Marks.
Hey, thanks for that question. So we can't give you an exact number, but it's going to be on the order of a few hundred individuals in terms of size. And we'd expect that might take a few months, whether it be 2 or 3, can't say exactly how long, but again, on that type of a scale of amount of time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. Operator, we'll take the next question.
One second here. Our next question comes from Helen Branswell with STAT. Your line is open.
Thank you very much for taking my question. It's in regard to the vaccines. What is FDA thinking at present about?
Can one wiener in the air not longer, which they've been trying to figure out about the UK and the South African, is it linger in the air more, or is there more variant being expressed off the body through the sinus and through the epidural of your body as you sweat, as they're finding out with these fucking clusters of people getting sick inside of gyms and shit? And with the kids. And then seeing that the kids can get infected, infect the parent and then back with less load, and it doesn't show that like the normal stuff, because they still keep going off of the old statistics of the shit that first came out, and it's like that's retarded. You can't do that. This is an evolving self-adapted virus, man. It's not already evolved past. You guys are using statistics on some shit that wasn't getting kids infected. Now it's getting kids infected. Well, how is it getting infected, and how are the kids being infected? And I'll say that kids can be around each other and the adults don't need to be fucking done. Like, that's stupid. Where's the guidance in that, man?
What the threshold would be for updating the vaccines? Obviously, you know, the development of new variants is a moving target, and I just wonder how you would feel confident that it would be time to update the vaccines, and how often could one do that without having to go back to the drawing board?
This is Janet Woodcock. I mean, I think we need to anticipate this and work on it so that we have something in our back pocket before the threshold is upon us, so to speak. So this is partly a matter of being prepared. I'll turn this over to Dr. Marks for a more technical discussion.
Okay. So thanks. I would echo what Dr. Woodcock said, that this is a matter of getting prepared. And so one of the things that will need to happen in the same model as we do for influenza, pandemic influenza, is that we need to be prepared. We need to have the studies conducted to facilitate potential strain changes sooner rather than later, so that if we need to swap something in, we can do it in a relatively quick manner, because as we've learned, that these variants can sometimes move through the population very quickly. So we want to be prepared for them, and that's what I think the manufacturers are already starting to gear up to do. How to trigger when to do that will be something that will have to be carefully considered, and it will involve a process that will likely involve input from global sources, including WHO, conversations with global regulatory colleagues, various regulatory and public health agencies, and then probably consideration of our own at our vaccines and related products advisory committee meeting. So it is something that will require careful consideration, but we have to be prepared in the event that we need to do. And the question you asked about how often that it should be done is a very, very good one, because we don't want to do it too often, because that would be potentially putting strain on the system. And then there are also some potential other reasons in terms of not wanting to repeatedly have to boost people with different vaccines. So it will be carefully considered, and the benefits to risks will be weighed as we go forward.
May I ask a follow-up question, please? Dr. Marks, you just mentioned pandemic influenza. I mean, that's when a pandemic arises, you swap out the existing strands and you put in one new. So you're not making a multivalent, you're making a monovalent. Is that what you're thinking about here, or are you thinking about adding another antigen to the vaccine, which of course would diminish global production capacity?
Great question. So ideally, the studies that we describe in our guidance talk about how we'd like the manufacturers to look at whether the new strain that they're making, the new vaccine that they're making, can potentially cover for the existing strain, because ideally one would like to swap here and not have to make a bivalent or a multivalent vaccine. But obviously the data will drive that, and the point is exactly well taken, that you would rather not have to have a decrease in production, essentially, because it would, if you had to make a multivalent vaccine, you'd have to make more different molecules. So point well taken, and that's described in the guidance how we feel that needs to be looked at for each of the new strains that might be considered.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mark. Just a reminder that if the operator does not announce your name and your organization, if you could just repeat your name and share your media outlet, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Operator, we'll take the next question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jackie Lee from Bloomberg Law. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you guys so much for taking my question. Dr. Marks, you mentioned this need to be prepared, to have these booster shots if we need them. Does the FDA suggest manufacturers start looking at making these booster shots now, or have a stockpile source of booster shots for variants if they're needed, and then can be released as soon as they're necessary? Or how would you advise the manufacturers to be handling variants right now in terms of production?
So I think I can't say about whether they need to start production of these, but we certainly, since the clinical trials will take a couple of months, we think it's prudent to start doing clinical trials. Obviously, they'll have to make small-scale batches, but not large-scale clinical amounts of these, to be able to test these in clinical trials to understand that they do what we'd like them to do. Besides making sure that they develop an immune response that's comparable against the new variant as it was to the original strain, we might also like to see them, as is described in the guidance, make sure that it's safe to boost people who have already been vaccinated with these, and those trials could start better. We're encouraging people to start them sooner rather than later, without necessarily triggering production yet. I think what would start to trigger production would be when we started to have a conversation with our global colleagues that a strain change was more imminent.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mark. Operator, we'll take the next question.
Our next question comes from Hannah Kuchler from Financial Times. The line is open.
Thanks. So, Dr. Marks, you talked a lot about global cooperation. Will you need to make the switch between vaccines at the same time across the world, and why?
Peter, go ahead with that.
I had a little trouble hearing you, but will we be trying to do this with in coordination with others across the world? Was that the question?
Yeah. Will you need to make the switch at the same time, and why is that important?
So I can't say whether we'll make it at exactly the same time, but I suspect from our conversations with global regulators already that it'll probably be in a near, whether it happens exactly at the same time or around the same time, it's probably likely that there'll be some coordination with what's going on here, in part because this is a global problem, and the variants that are in one location seem to be making it to other locations pretty quickly. So the difference might be a matter of a month or two or three, perhaps, but I think, in large part, I think this may be relatively globally synced to a greater, within a reasonable degree.
Something that if you had on the side, if you were in there taking a bath or a shower, if you pushed it and keep the water from coming on.
Thank you again, Dr. Marks. Operator, we will take the next question, please.
Our next question comes from Sue Sutter from the Pink Sheet. The line is open.
Thanks very much. I have another vaccines question. The guidance includes recommendations on non-inferiority margins for the immunogenicity studies. Can you sort of explain those recommendations in layman's terms? Does it mean a modified vaccine can't be more than 10% less effective in terms of seroresponse than the original prototype vaccine?
Peter, thank you. Dr. Marks?
Yeah, so thanks very much. So the idea here is, since you're using a laboratory endpoint, and you're trying to make sure that the immune response is on the same order of magnitude. These non-inferiority margins are a way of just saying that if the immune response is to that great an extent, we will feel confident that the clinical response that we're going to see at the end of the day in patients who are given the vaccine is going to be similar to that the original patients had against the vaccine to the original strain. So it's a way of making sure that we don't essentially accept something that might ultimately produce less of a clinical effect. We want to make it so that if we have to swap out one of these strains or change it over, that people will feel confident that at the end of the day, the efficacy that we'll see on the other end is similar. We don't have that perfect right now because we don't have the precise immune correlates of protection, but that's why we're using the tools that we have in our toolkit to do our best.
So as a follow-up, am I interpreting that correctly about that negative 10% on the non-inferiority margin for seroresponse? So the idea would be that the idea would be that they're close enough to one another that the immune response is within that realm. 10% to 15% non-inferiority margins are often used in these types of trials, and so they've set it at 10%. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Operator, we'll take that next question now.
Absolutely. Our final question comes from Alexander Tin from CBS. Your line is open.
Hi, this is Alex. Thanks for taking my question. You've mentioned previously that some of this guidance was modeled off of how the influenza vaccine is updated on a regular basis. Can you talk us through both maybe some highlights and what is similar to that process, as well as maybe what might be considered a major difference between that pathway and this pathway for the vaccine? Thanks.
Sure. This is Jana Woodcock. I mean, obviously, what we were saying is we have experience with the fact that viruses change over time, and seasonal influenza changes very frequently. But we do have experience in building on our current knowledge and not going back to the beginning. So I'll turn to Dr. Marks again to talk about the vaccine specifically.
So Dr. Woodcock started me off great. So what we're doing here that's similar is trying to leverage the change with the minimal amount of extra data that we need to facilitate things. We're trying to be prepared in advance like we would for influenza to swap something in, not waiting until something was rampant. We want to be ready so that we can move it into production when it's ready. When it's needed. There is some difference here. The difference is that for influenza, we are so accustomed to doing this, and we know the reproducibility of doing it, that we don't actually need to do clinical studies of immunogenicity. We can simply do laboratory studies and do these things called strain change supplements that don't involve submission of clinical data from humans. For the first few vaccines, in contrast, that are going to be for COVID-19, we're going to need to have some of this immunogenicity data because we need to understand whether the new vaccine strain is able to cover both the new strain and the old strain, or whether it just covers the new strain. We also need to understand whether when that is given to somebody who's already received the vaccines against the full vaccine series against the old strain, that it still provokes a good immune response and it doesn't cause any safety concerns. Probably after we do that 3 or 4 times, we'll look at everything, and if everything seems consistent, then we might move more towards the influenza-like model. But for right now, they are different in that respect in terms of needing some clinical data in the COVID-19 vaccines versus the influenza vaccines.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. This concludes today's media briefing. A replay will be available on FDA's YouTube page. If you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact the FDA press office. Our email address is fdaoma@fda.hhs.gov. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
And TV. Epic. We got dude pulling 10 amps. Running the silver. Laptop. Sauna so for. Ice Coast status freezer. And running the 10 amp battery charger to charge up the backhoe battery. Let's kick this thing on. I'll turn it to max. Bam. King deep freezer. I got the battery charger. Charging up this battery for the backhoe. Another van battery, and charge it, run it. Chipper battery, charge it. Pulling 13 amps, 14, 200 watt. That's today's accumulation of power. Since I kicked the stuff on. Whoa. All solar. No cars hooked up, no nothing. And Morpheus DCs. Gonna be working over here and getting this cleaned out more. Dialed in and making a turnabout. Comes around in there. I was gonna bring the backhoe over, but I'm gonna do it tomorrow after we get the gravel done. So I'm charging the battery up. So there's no point in doing that right now. We're gonna start taking as many loads of branches as we can to line the driveway where we don't want people to go to. Get that stuff out the way so we can just chop. Get this clean. Get this as garden food areas, and we start bringing rice hulls and rice protein and the soil from our pond we're building over that way. Bring up here and use for our mixing as we step to do our food production. Inshallah. Living light, everybody. I'm gonna figure out this driveway if we terraform it. So I'm looking at this water. It ain't raining like a week, and we got this much water stored right here. Just coming up out the mine. The mine is full of water. So we're gonna have to do like a French drain or something. All that rock is just gonna get sucked up. Like all the stuff that we've been putting here over the years. Now finally with a good rain we see, wow, this is all blackberry. But I need to do a French drain. So I'll have to have the rock piled here. And I was asking Abuela if she wants to do the driveway up that way differently. And we do a pond right here. For the garden, for food and stuff, and the animals. I'm on that one good. There's a hell of a tree over here. The trees are just standing. No, they're not. We over like 4 trees, 5 trees over there. 5 trees. Gotta get in over there, clean it up. Yeah. Definitely gotta do a French drain or something there. There's so much water right there, looking at it. I need it. We got 25 tons of rock coming. trees with. Here is where I was trying to get you to look at. Like always in life. Here, honey, right here. This is what I'm talking about. Way over there in the trees and stuff he was looking at and all that. Right here. Right here. Right here. So, keep as a driveway or make it to a pond. And divert the driveway going that way. Over here, as I was talking about. I don't know why he was walking over there and everything. So I'm talking about here. The rock comes on Monday. Tomorrow.
Yeah, let's explore which.
Because we're going to have to dig this out to make the water go away. Otherwise, it will swallow up all the rock. That's why Spirit was telling me to put the cage and the other stuff I was telling you about.
But if it's what it is, there's so much rock you can put on it. Otherwise, we save this spot. All this is very little growth. Really, there's no big trees in between what we're saying. You can see the driveway, so we open these and the driveway. We still gotta do work anyway, right?
See, it still has to be cleaned up.
And we explore these. And see, we got just those big trees back here. It's all open.
Just those two trees, that's all I'm saying. Just cut through this and change the driveway where it goes up and around.
And it'll be like this. Basically, this opened up a straight shot. Not so weird of a coming.
Tea house, something, but
Water for the goats.
that's
maybe.
just to see how much water it retains, what it is, or how much work it is to change. Because it's easy to dig it out and turn it into a small pond. To do the aggregate in a French drain properly is a little bit of work because we need to check all this and tie this in to where it all drains and goes one way. Since this is a low point over here. Otherwise, this is not a low point, it's actually a high side. We wouldn't have an issue with mud. And coming on the other side of the Turnegate and up through where I was saying the aircraft table stuff is right here in between the two trees.
Wow, this is going to open up tremendously. I like it. So we don't look. So coming like this from the cheaper straight here. We got those big trees on the left. Coming in like this, just these pine trees left. Right here.
Driving this way. Coming like such. Moving this. Diverting and either coming around or coming through this way. Or having it come around. And this be in the center. And have that as a walk path or a secondary in or out.
That's something hard.
My scope. Stopes into the mine. Stopes, stopes, stopes. So, those guys
That's a drift cut right here. That's a drift cut. Yep. That goes next to that stope over there that I was wanting to use as a reservoir. This goes this way in here. And that hole right there where that big rock is. And excavate this stuff. But yeah, if you want to go, if we come up that way, it'd be easier on vehicles for trailers and all that kind of stuff. We just kind of map plan how we connect back into that, or if we just continue this way. The issue is the drift right here. So it's pretty. Yeah, between these guys, I guess. Yeah. So up. We'll do the driveway where it splits around this big tree, this big cedar. We'll come around it. It'll be this side coming in on the rock and this side coming in around the rock. So that tree to that tree will be our gate. If we decide to go through like that. Or we come through this side. Come on. Or we come through this side where we just have these oaks right here that have to be cut in between these two big trees. Yep. And come with the backhoe and the excavator and just
make it a nice grade and just go through that and not get through the mess of the slopes because
see. There's
I like that better to circumvent it.
It'll be a straight shot up, in and down, in and out. In and out. Do that. Dig and excavate that guy out. I'll make a pond right there. With a solar pump and everything, that'd be our first line to sprinkler defense for the area. We're on this side, you know. I'll go through right there. Make the driveway go through there. Set it right there. Turn this into a pond that takes up.
I feel like we should be able to clear it up in no time.
Inshallah, hopefully turn this into a whole pond right here where the car is at. With a walk thing and all that kind of little food and farm. Also meditation and tea stuff. Have solar. Turn that into like 4,000 or 5,000 gallon since the water's coming up, we should be able to take care of the evaporation. Should be able to replenish it. So dig this out kind of deep and line it. Oh shit! Oh, disappeared. Walk that way. Oh, put my boots on. This water has not disappeared. And the creeks ain't flowing nowhere. That must be why they got the canal closed, because the reservoirs are so damn low right now. Huh? The canal. No, I know. I said that must be why they ain't got the water running in the canal, because the reservoirs are so low. Pick up trash. Fucking people, damn it. So, instead of working on this side today, we're going to work on that driveway. Redo the driveway. So we're going to got the chainsaws up, and gas and oil barrel, and the battery that I've been charging, and do the driveway. Inshallah. Right. Operation driveway goes that way now. Commence. So this would be a walk path down into the pond, as we were saying. And then cut between these big tree and that big tree. Have it come down. Use the backhoe and excavate the ground. Make it a nice transition. So yeah. So this guy. Well, I got the steel toes on now. Just gonna put her some chaps on too. There you go. She got her armor. Yeah. Thank you, brother. Brian. I got my scar on my foot. I almost cut my damn shit off. But I gotta get another pair of steel toes. Dude, no. Let me help you. Ooh. You make Logan look good, baby. Battery up more. Let's get this going.
Dude, I got a fucking background
She
and you're looking fucking shit. Get out of here. You wanna lock me here, Lacey?
Get her drone 0.0. No, get her. Get her to 0.0. Get her to 0.0.
Self-love. Oh my god. Oh, beautiful. Heck yeah.
Blackberries. Blackberries! They're good, but man, are they deadly for years to come. Oh, she's doing a B-boy, a B-girl pose. What?
So incapacitated.
Oh boy, they're doing her thing. I don't know, on the small trees, working herself up to big ones. Getting it in, baby. Bam. See how she do it? She put everything on one spot. Ain't no mercy. Getting her. Alright, I'm gonna take these ones right here. This dude. And then down the hill we go. And then bucking them down. And then we get Casey over here. And then we start digging over there and seeing how fast the water fills up. Getting down the hill. I get Casey over here. Dig this out, excavate it, make a driveway in between these two. Get this dude cut down. Come out this way. Boom. Getting closer. Get this foot buck down, get this tree cut. Get it down. Time to bug it down. Right down and grab everything. Stack it on the trailer. And then come with the backhoe and excavate. Getting through. What the? What the? Yeah. Getting it in. Got it pre-cut. We just gotta load up and then get the backhoe going and get the stump stuff out of the way and grade it. Yeah. And utilize that water down there. Make it a pond. What's better than a gold mine? A gold mine full of water and water is food. Better get it, boy. Like a boss. Getting it in, charging up the battery, take the load down, charging the battery because I'm going to dig a trench real before it gets dark with the backhoe. A little trench, see how much water coming into it, so on and so forth. Still going to make it a pond, just see if it can fill itself, whatnot, but yada yada. Get this done before it get dark.
They have what seems to be non-rapid eye movement sleep. They don't have REM sleep. And of course, birds and mammals evolved later in the trajectory of evolution, so it tells us that REM sleep, dream sleep, is the new kid on the block in terms of sleep when it comes to its evolutionary age.
So what's happening then in the deeper stages of 3 and 4 that can we tell how exactly that enhances learning and memory and other features that we might share with these other species?
Yes, so we now know that during that deepest stage of sleep, stages 3 and 4, it's also called in the sleep community slow wave sleep. And the reason is because you get these huge, enormous, slow brain waves that happen, incredibly powerful, large brain waves. And it's a very synchronous rhythm. So when we're all awake, and at least 20% of the audience is at this stage, different parts of, I think my brain is such a potent sedative, my voice. So during the day when your brain is awake, different parts of your brain are processing information at different moments in time and performing different functions. As a consequence, your brain is what we call desynchronized in its activity. The analogy would be a football stadium before a big game. When the crowd is in there before the game starts, everyone's having their separate conversations and you don't really hear a clear, powerful signal coming from the stadium. But let's say this is a Berkeley football stadium and they're playing Stanford and the game gets underway. Now the entire crowd is synchronized in a unison, singular voice saying, Stanford sucks. They're chanting that, okay? Or Berkeley sucks if you're at Stanford. I think Stanford's great. Now, so, as I will never be let back into the Berkeley campus, what that means is that hundreds of thousands of voices have all synchronized themselves in time in the signal. That's what happens during the deepest stages of sleep. Hundreds of thousands of cells within your brain all decide to start chanting in this slow mantra fashion. And why? We don't fully understand. But it's utterly unique. What we now start to think, however, that type of synchronized brainwave activity supports is a file transfer mechanism. It allows you to shift information from one storage location, a temporary short-term storage location, to a different geographical location within the brain, a more permanent storage location. So the analogy would be a USB stick and a hard drive. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which you know very well. Indri has been a pioneer in studying
studying this structure, it turns out. And it's like the memory inbox of your brain. It's great at grabbing new files and binding them together. But what we also know is that at night, that hippocampus, that inbox, which is like the USB stick, will then transfer its memory files of the day out into the hard drive of your brain, which is called the cortex, which is this folded mass of tissue that sits on top of your brain. And this deep sleep seems to promote a therapy session, a sort of a dialogue between these two structures. And so you transfer, there is sort of a real estate transaction of information happens at night.
And there's these lovely studies of people who study something and then they take a nap or they don't do anything, and then it turns out that they can remember better if they've taken a nap. But that falls away after 24 hours in some cases because you've been able to go into sleep. Is that really part of the job of stages 3 and 4? Is it to also help us forget the things that are irrelevant during the day? Do we see any evidence of kind of people who are sleep deprived showing memory intrusions of things that they should have forgotten that now they're confused by, or do we just see that they just don't remember what they should have remembered?
Yeah, so we used to think that sleep was a bit of a blunt instrument when it comes to learning and memory, that everything that you experienced during the day was essentially going to get cemented. So it's like hitting the save button on all of the files that you've aggregated. Now we understand that sleep is far more intelligent, that sleep can actually transact both remembering and forgetting. And it uses what we call salience tags. So if there are things that seem to be novel or things that are especially emotional, the brain tends to latch onto those things and promote them in terms of remembering. Things that seem to be trivial, that are not salient, that are not emotional, that are not important to you, the organism, sleep seems to let go of them, and if anything, will actually remove them. And you think, well, hang on a second, the function of memory is always to remember. That's not true. I mean, forgetting is probably the price that we pay for accurate remembering. Imagine remembering every parking spot when you're trying to remember today where you parked your car. Not so smart, is it? And the brain has a system for that, and sleep seems to be part of that intelligent memory system design.
So if that's what's happening in sort of the earlier stages of the night, what's happening during REM? Particularly as you mentioned that might be involved in creativity.
Yes, so REM sleep is the principal stage from which you dream, and one of the hard things is to try and figure out what is dream specific in terms of a function and what is simply REM sleep specific, because those two things are isomorphic. You can't really have dreams without REM sleep, so it's sometimes hard to put a wedge between those two, but let's speak about it for now as sort of dream sleep, REM sleep. Firstly, by the way, I should note that dreaming is a striking state of psychosis. In fact, everyone here, as long as you slept last night, and I hope you did, you all became flagrantly psychotic. Now, before you reject my diagnosis, let me give you 5 good reasons. Last night when you were dreaming, you started to see things which were not there, so you were hallucinating. Second, you believed things that couldn't possibly be true, so you were delusional. Third, you became confused about time, about place, and about person, so you're suffering from disorientation. Fourth, you had wildly fluctuating emotions, something that psychiatrists call being affectively labile. And then, how wonderful, you woke up this morning and you forgot most, if not all, of that dream experience. So you're suffering from amnesia. If you were to experience any one of those 5 symptoms while you're awake, you would be seeking psychiatric intervention. But yet, for reasons that seem to be perfectly normal, it's a biological and psychological necessity. The question then is, well, what's going on? What would be the function of that type of mental conscious experience? One of the things that we've discovered is that sleep, and including dream sleep, is critical for creativity. That sleep will offer about a 3-fold advantage in problem-solving creative capacity than the same amount of time simply spent awake. And it's perhaps not surprising as a consequence, nobody has ever told you should stay awake on a problem. People tell you to sleep on a problem. And we're finding the scientific proof that supports exactly that. What I should also note, by the way, is that every language that I've inquired about to date, that phrase exists, sleeping on a problem. What that means is that the creative benefit of dream sleep transcends cultural boundaries. It's common across the globe. What I should note is that we, the British, we say you sleep on a problem. The French translation is much closer to you sleep with a problem. So British, you sleep on a problem. French, you sleep with a problem. I think it says so much about the romantic difference between the British and the French. But there's a great story. Often when I sort of tell people about the creative benefits of sleep, they'll say, well, aren't there those creative genius types in history who are supposed to have been short sleepers? How does that square with what you're telling me? And one that's often quoted to me is Thomas Edison. Edison, who, by the way, has a great deal to answer for how we're sleeping or not sleeping in modern-day society, but a brilliant man, nonetheless, and Edison was supposed to be a short sleeper. Now, we'll never, of course, know if he was or not, but even if he was, it turns out that Edison was a habitual napper during the day. And in fact, he understood the creative brilliance of sleep, and he used it ruthlessly as a tool. What he would do is sit in his study, in his work chair, and he would have a pad of paper and a pen next to him. And then he would
scribe and meditate.
A metal saucepan, turn it upside down, and place it underneath the armrest. And then he would pick up 2 steel ball bearings in his hand and rest his arm on the back of the chair, on the armrest, and then gradually he would start to fall back and go to sleep. And so he didn't fall too far into sleep. What would happen is that his muscle tone would relax. He would release the steel ball bearings. They would crash on the saucepan underneath him, wake him up, and then he would write down all of the ideas that he was having from his sleep. Isn't that brilliant?
It is brilliant.
Genius.
And so maybe the big invention that he had that changed our sleep patterns forever really weren't a problem for him. So
exactly.
Let's talk about how people slept before Edison and how that's changed.
Yeah, so it's actually a very interesting question, which is to say, how are we sleeping right now in first world countries, and how should we be sleeping? Are those two the same? And the answer perhaps is no. That right now, across most industrialized nations, the way we sleep is in one single bout at night. It's what we call monophasic sleep, one phase of sleep. If you look at cultures that are untouched by electricity, so if you look at the Kung in the Kalahari desert, if you look at the Jabra, for example, in northern Kenya, these are remarkably remote cultures, untouched, as I said, by Western civilization. They tend to sleep in what we call a biphasic pattern. They will have about 6.5 hours of sleep a night, from sort of midnight through until dawn. And then in the afternoon, they will have anywhere between 45 to 90 minutes of sleep, the siesta-like behavior. And that seems to be perhaps how we were actually programmed to sleep, what's called, as I say, biphasically. And the reason, the argument, is that everyone here around 2 or 3 or 4 p.m. in the afternoon, if I have some measurement equipment on you that I can assess your physiological alertness, you all show a programmed, genetically determined dip in your alertness. It's that, when you've sort of been around the boardroom table in meetings after lunch, and you sort of start to get all of these head nods going on. It's not people listening to good music. It's that they're falling prey to this dip in your alertness. It's consistent nap behavior.
You're listening to The Science of Sleep with Matthew Walker in conversation with Indre Viscontis. This is City Arts and Lectures.
What's interesting is that back a few years ago in Greece, where they were still having this sort of siesta profile, at least the males were, turns out females not just now awake, they were about to abolish the siesta, the nap behavior pattern throughout society. And scientists said, well, okay, if you're going to do that, can we study it? And rates of cardiovascular disease, of stroke, of diabetes, of anxiety, depression, these things skyrocketed as a consequence. And you can even see that sleep manipulation twice a year. When we shift the clock
Wake up, people.
When you add that hour of sleep, 6 months later, heart attacks drop the following day. Road traffic accidents drop the following
Resew the
day.
end of the blanket back onto the same blanket.
So
Call it
we're starting
longer.
to understand that there's even for small modifications of your sleep, it doesn't have to be something
Mindset of the cage of the self enclavement just fucks you off, and you just
And the reason that concerns me is because right now, 1 out of every 2 Americans is trying to survive on 7 hours of sleep or less. 1 in 5 of the people out on the street is trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less. So the decimation
You've never been on the streets, bro.
industrialized nations
Try
is
like
having
4
a
if you're lucky.
catastrophic impact on our
Hours
health
straight.
and our wellness. And it really is a sleep loss epidemic. It's a
3 at most.
What
2 is
that
likely
magic
what you
number?
get,
How many
depending
hours
on
a
what
night
part of
should
the
we
city
be
and shit
sleeping?
in.
So
If you're not in a group
is that human World Health Organization recommends
of sober
8 hours
sleep.
of sleep a night. And a lot of people have a reaction.
Again, I underline sober
And
sleep.
it's the same reaction that people say, oh, Matt, and I say, usually about
Inebriated sleep is
8
easy.
to 8.5 hours. People look at you.
That's
there's
why you
this
see those
slight
people
sort of,
just pass the fuck out on the sidewalk.
and the
Yeah,
reason
they're
that they
just
have that reaction of really
going for so long that they can't, pass out next to like
we in my field of sleep have an
Lights or
Right
high
now,
traffic areas,
Yeah.
we equate
so that they feel safe.
sufficient sleep with laziness.
The only thing that'll wake them up is a police
terrible,
officer,
terrible stigma. Real harm to medical health.
so they get help.
And what's strange is that we
Otherwise,
always have that.
ain't nobody can fuck
The
with them.
example would be nobody looks at an infant sleeping during the day and says, "What a lazy baby."
I wish my baby was lazier.
But we don't. Why don't we do that? We don't do that because that time of life is fundamentally important. What's frightening is that somewhere between infancy and even now childhood, we abandon the notion that sleep is important, and worse, we stigmatize it. In fact, we are proud to report how
I
little
don't see
sleep
nobody
we get.
making their kids go to
And I
sleep
think
no
we
more
are
for a
with
nap.
our state of sleep deprivation where we were with smoking 30 years ago.
Jeez, I hate that shit.
All of the science
That's
was
lay
there.
ass out. I
We
don't want to go
knew
to sleep.
that smoking was
Lay down and
carcinogenic. We
fucking
knew that it caused cancer. But the public health message had not gone out.
Nap time.
Governments had not implemented policies. And as a
Oh,
consequence,
plans.
for that intermediary 30 years of time,
Yeah, nap time is in
before we
schools and
started
shit.
to do something about it, people had terrible health, people were dying. That is the current state with sleep deprivation. And I think we need to shift into that mindset of our battle with smoking and cancer. I mean, back then, you could turn on the television and, people were promoting smoking as something that was cool. Commercials were there. There were even race cars going around tracks that were sponsored by big tobacco companies.
Still is.
You see that right now with sleep deprivation in modern society. It's promoted as something that you can be proud of. And I think
Every
what's
gas station.
interesting
Hit on
about
every
smoking
gas station that you walk
is that
into, man.
in the
You
last
just see
10
fucking
years,
stay up for
we switched
76,
from trying to
96
treat
hours.
all of the problems that
That
were coming
fucking
from
24-hour
smoking
shot. They
to
had
a
the
model of
24 to
prevention,
48,
which is to remove
96-hour fucking little
from
shot bottle.
the public domain. That's
And then
what
Red
we
Bull.
need to do with
Everything
sleep
spit
right
up.
now.
Get your wings.
If we
Tweak
don't
out.
want to suffer 30 years of terrible mortality, morbidity rates, we need to shift our mindset away from simply treating, which is what we're doing now, the snap elastic band of sleep deprivation. And it can only stretch so far, and it's snapped now, to a model of prevention, which is where we reclaim our right to a full night of sleep without embarrassment and
These
without
kids
that stigma.
now, they
And
fucked
maybe
up.
one place to start is with the kids. Just like, probably the first person you take a cigarette away from is a
Staying on
child.
that screen time.
We have now this movement to try to change the timing of schooling, of when school starts and so forth. So what do you think should be
This
an
must be
ideal
old or something.
school schedule that we should adopt?
Yeah, well, considering what we now know about the importance of sleep for learning and memory, and how critical it actually is, I think the educational domain is perhaps one of the strongest importance, together with perhaps old age and mental age. We can speak about too, where there's a strong sleep link. But there is now a movement.
But what's the point, dude?
It's a tracking movement, and it
160
needs to accelerate.
million jobs is going to disappear by this in 4 years to AI.
And let me just give you one study that convinced
What are you teaching these babies right now that they need to stay up and be stressed the fuck out and be killing themselves over for jobs that is not gonna be there?
The school start times for their teens from 7:30 in the morning to 8:25 in the morning. By the way, what are we trying to do to educate teenagers at 7:25? But anyway, so here's the data.
I was at school before 7:25, nigga.
The top performing students the year before they made the time switch. And for those top performing students, their SAT score was 1,288, which is a great score. The following year, when they shifted the school start times to 8:25, the only thing that was more impressive than the extra 43 minutes of sleep that those kids reported getting was their change in SAT score. That same top percent performing students, that same top percent group, their SAT score was 1,500. That is a non-trivial increase. That will change which university ultimately those students go to, and probably the trajectory of their lives. Why are we doing this to our youth? We're hamstringing them in terms of their education. And it's also not fair on the teachers. We should not expect teachers to be going into a classroom and trying to infuse sleep-deprived brains. You know, if our goal as educators is to educate, we need to change our view of sleep.
How does sleep change across the lifespan? And is it as you get older, is it just that we get busier, or is there actual brain changes that we can measure that make us less good at sleeping?
Yes.
So it's certainly the latter. Across the lifespan, sleep does change, and it changes dramatically. It changes from infancy to childhood to adulthood and then into old age.
Things change. The child, any brain infections,
that starts to deteriorate
any fucking
in terms of your sleep, and it deteriorates
destruction or outside
deep sleep
impacts.
that's important for learning and memory.
Change all that.
Even by the time you're in your early 30s, I can already measure reductions to your deep sleep.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you're 50, you have about 50% less of the deep sleep that you had
if you don't
when
meditate.
you were a teenager. By the time you're 70, you have about 5% of that deep sleep left. Now, what we of course know is that as we get older, our learning and memory capacity starts to decline. And what I've just told you is that as we get older, we also know that our sleep starts to deteriorate. And just recently, we published evidence that those two things are not simply co-occurring. They are significantly interrelated. It suggests that sleep disruption is an underappreciated factor that is contributing to memory problems as we get older. And now it seems in dementia as well. Now, I know that sounds remarkably depressing, but there's a silver lining. We can do something about sleep. Sleep is a treatable target. So unlike many of the other features of the aging brain, changes in blood flow or changes to the structure of the brain, they are fiendishly difficult to treat. Medicine doesn't have good ways to alter them. We do have ways to modify sleep. And so I think it's an optimistic possibility, and we're trying to do that now. There's actually a device that we're using called a transcranial direct current brain stimulation device. So again, why neuroscience has to come up with it? It's a brain stimulator, okay? And it sounds like science fiction, but it's science fact. If I apply this stimulator, and it's a little box, it's a portable, affordable piece of technology, it's about the size of a cell phone, and you apply these electrodes either side of your brain, and you start to stimulate the brain. Now, if you stimulate the brain during sleep, as if you're singing in time with those deep brain waves that we spoke about, in young, healthy adults, not only do you amplify the size of those brain waves, in doing so, you can almost double the amount of memory benefit that you get from sleep. The question now is, can we translate that same technology into older adults and those suffering from dementia? Can we restore some healthy degree of quality sleep? And in doing so, can we salvage the memory function?
So are there, people talk now about all kinds of sedatives and sleep aids that are in pill form. Do these work? Do they get you into the same stages of sleep? Do they mimic a night of healthy sleep? Do they have consequences that we should avoid? Is that a way to enhance sleep in people who are, experiencing age-related sleep deprivation?
Yeah, so the sleep aid industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So 9 million people in the last month alone swallowed some kind of sleep medication. It's frightening. The question is, what do those sleep medications do? And perhaps that's the even more frightening part, because the answer is we don't fully yet understand. Firstly, the older sleep medications, they were called the sedative hypnotics. Nobody was going to argue that when you took those drugs that you were awake. You definitely weren't awake. But based on the name, you can already understand what they did. They would sedate you. Sedation is not sleep. It's fundamentally different. You don't get the same physiological benefits that you get. Even the newer sleep medications, however, do not seem to produce what we would think of as naturalistic sleep. So yes, you sleep for longer, or I should actually say technically, yes, you are not awake for 8 hours, would be the best way I could describe it physiologically. But if you look at the electrical signature of sleep, like a fingerprint, and everyone has, you can produce these fingerprint graphs of your sleep. That medicated sleep that you get is not the same electrically as naturalistic sleep. And because millions of people are taking these medications, we need to know what the effects are. Is it that those sleeping medications enhance your memory like natural sleep does? That would be great. Or are actually they reversing the benefit of memory? Because no drug company wants on their label, you're going to sleep soundly for 8 hours, but you won't remember anything of yesterday. And what's interesting is that I know of one study that's really tried to examine this, and we need more, and there's a tension between probably the pharmaceutical companies and National Institutes of Health to fund this work, and I understand that, but there was a study done in developing animals. This was a study done from University of Pennsylvania, and they were looking at how these animals would learn during the day, and then during sleep would delightfully enhance the rewiring of the brain. It's like the hitting of the laser on those memories. And there are physical changes within the brain that happen to score that memory trace even more strongly into the brain. And sleep does that work of strengthening the memory trace. But when these animals were given a drug called zolpidem, which is more commonly known as Ambien, not only did you fail to get the rewiring benefit of sleep, you lost about 50% the rewiring that had happened. And that worries me, because if you look at the prescription
talking about all the homies.
for sleep medications,
ask some of your parents on this shit. You got a girlfriend? You on this? You on this stuff? Or ask some women? You on this? Your parents on this shit?
That the age range is starting
you
to
gonna do this?
infiltrate our educational population.
This shit right here, man.
Actually worries me.
This is some fucked up shit.
It seems that some of these sleep aids are addictive, right? Is that true? That if you start taking one of these
a whole different alternate person fucking brain gets wired.
Without them later on.
When you come off those drugs, you have a rebound effect. It's called the rebound insomnia
8 years
effect.
for you to become a
so
different
right now, medicine will only, or let me sort of say that you should only be on those sleep medications for a short-term period of time. They are only there for acute phases of insomnia. They are not recommended by the Board of Medicine
to take more than one time in your life.
And you don't need to use those sleep medications, it turns out, necessarily, because we actually have wonderful behavioral ways to modify your sleep. There is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It's called CBTI, little I, like your iPhone, CAPS CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And it's a great behavioral technique. It has just as much efficacious benefit at improving your sleep during the time that you're having the therapy as you would have if you were taking the medications. But the great thing is that when you stop that therapy, the benefit to your sleep continues, unlike the medication. So we're really now starting to develop alternatives to medication. I'm not trying to suggest that all sleep medications in all circumstances are bad. That's not the case. They have their time and place, but that you should be on them chronically in a long-term fashion is clearly not the accepted method.
Well, I think it's about time for us to open up the questions to the audience. And as they're getting that ready, I just want to ask you a real quick question. Why is it that when people get abducted by aliens, it's when they're sleeping?
This sounds like grabbing
So,
hiccup.
in addition to, there are two wacky questions that it turns out I always have an answer for. Firstly, I will do a pro bono dream interpretation if anyone would like to give me that. The second one is that I will explain alien abductions. When you go into rapid eye movement sleep, which is dream sleep, your brain will paralyze your body. And it's an evolutionary adaptive mechanism. Your brain locks your body in this prison of paralysis so your mind can dream safely, so you don't act out your dreams. Occasionally, when you're waking up out of dream sleep, normally that prison of paralysis is released.
That's the difference between a real alien abduction and the fucking sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis, and alien abduction. You don't have that.
The brain forgets to switch off the paralysis. So you start to become consciously aware of your surroundings, but you can't move. You can't speak, you can't talk, you can't lift your eyelids, voluntary muscles. It's often associated with a sense of dread, a sense of someone being there in the room. It's a very frightening experience. And it accurately explains most all alien abductions. When was the last time that you heard of someone being abducted by aliens in the middle of the day? You know, nobody is sitting there at sort of the boardroom again. And in the middle of the afternoon, you hear this sound. You know, what was that? Well, I think Jimmy was just abducted by aliens. Did everyone see that? No, it never happens like that. It's at night. You're in bed. You describe a presence in the room. You say that they injected you with some paralyzing agent so you couldn't fight back. It's simply sleep paralysis that's not being released.
This first question is going to come from the back and center of the orchestra. You both mentioned a little bit about babies and how, as infants, they have a different sleep pattern than children and teens and adults, and as we get older. So I have a few people in my life who just had twins, and one who's having a newborn. Are worried about their quality because the babies are going to wake up in the middle of the night and wake them up. So usually the response is to, like you said, teach the baby how to go to sleep. I wonder what are your thoughts on the other recommendation, which is to fall asleep when your baby does?
So if that's a possibility, that you should certainly take advantage of that. It's a time when sleep is desperately fragmented throughout both the day and the night. And at that moment, sleep becomes less about something you can architect yourself regarding the clock face, and instead something that is opportunistic. So really, I would try to recommend people, if you have the ability to use shift systems, if you have another caregiver there, think about that so there is equity, so that each person gets the right amount of opportunity sleep. I know that nursing sometimes makes that equity not quite possible, but at that stage, going into perhaps this biphasic like sleep pattern, where if you're only able to get 5 hours of solid sleep at night, thinking about that siesta-like behavior in the afternoon is certainly a good idea. We do understand that getting that 7 to 8 hours of sleep, certainly more on this side of 8 hours, is important, but how you get that, perhaps in this biphasic like manner, is just fine. So it's not necessarily detrimental to get that sleep in those two phases. So if it's possible, I would recommend it.
Hi, I'm just wondering about the role of melatonin and how it affects sleep and what happens when people take melatonin pills, which I know is fairly common.
So melatonin is a hormone naturally occurring within your body. It's often called the hormone of darkness, not because it's sort of sinister. It's also sometimes called the vampire hormone, not because it makes you look longingly at people's necklines. It's simply because it comes out at night. The way that your brain communicates to all of the cells in the rest of the brain, all of your body, is to release melatonin. Melatonin is the chemical bullhorn that shouts to your brain and body, it is nighttime. So melatonin is a great way to synchronize and tell your brain, now is the time to sleep. And it's the reason that it's very helpful if you
Well, you do it in a
time
nice manner
zones.
so they don't get
And let's
colic
say
and all
I
that
fly
kind of
back
stuff.
home
So
to
they're not
England,
like for an
it's
hour
8-hour time
of
zone.
them trying
Now
to
my
rest,
biological clock is
burping up stuff
completely
and having
mismatched
indigestion and all that.
to the London time clock in itself.
This
I
is
can
like a whole
use
procedure on the
melatonin
parents too to like
help
set up.
fool my brain
It takes a
into
minute to like
thinking that it's nighttime when
figure
it
out how to do
wouldn't
that.
otherwise be
It takes
registering
everybody
nighttime because
involved.
my melatonin peak. So right now, all of us, as long as we've been in this time zone, in about 4 or 5 hours, your
I
melatonin
never really
levels
quite
are going to
acquired that.
peak. It's going to help tell your brain body it's time to sleep. But if I fly to England, which is 8 hours ahead in time,
once they're not just straight milk,
now when it's nighttime in England,
cereal,
it's still
cream
8 hours behind. It's still, the middle of the afternoon in California. So my brain isn't yet receiving a melatonin signal. My melatonin spike is 8 hours back in time. But I can take a melatonin pill and fool my brain thinking, oh my goodness, we've completely misjudged it. It's nighttime, let's get to sleep. But melatonin doesn't seem to be a particularly effective sleep medication once you're stabilized within a time zone. Now, that's not to say that melatonin isn't potentially useful. What I mean is that relative to placebo, melatonin doesn't seem to perform above and beyond placebo once you've stabilized in a time zone. But I think the placebo effect is fantastic. It is the most reliable effect in all of pharmacology. Now,
but why not add meditation in with the placebo?
Notice what that tells us. It tells us there is such a thing as mind over matter. If you just fool your brain into thinking that it's getting treated, it will treat itself. That's what the placebo effect tells you. And there is now a raft of neuroscience that is actively pursuing the placebo effect.
It is truly placebo.
To self-healing. It's been staring us in the face for 40 years of neuropharmacology. So if you think a sleep aid is working for you, whether or not scientists tell you that it's working, if it does seem to give you a benefit, keep taking it.
Could you be kind enough to comment on chronotype, the larks and the owls, and also the stigmatization of the owls? Because I'm one of them.
Yes. So chronotype is simply your preference for morningness versus eveningness. And we describe those as larks and owls. Owls like to stay up late, wake up late. Larks like to sort of go to bed early and wake up early. And society has principally been designed around the larks and is very much designed against the owls with real health implications for folks like yourself. What's causing that? It turns out that a lot of it is due to genetics. There are genes that will determine your chronotype, whether you prefer mornings, whether you prefer evenings in terms of optimal time periods. So we understand the biology behind it. What's interesting, by the way, is that even though you are genetically defined as an owl or a lark, from conception, of course, your sweet spot of morningness and eveningness changes across the lifespan. So, when you're a child, even though you wanted to stay awake late, you couldn't really. So you'd be going to bed early and you'd wake up early, much to the annoyance of your parents. Then, once you hit those teenage years, now you like to go to bed later and wake up later. And then as you progress into adulthood, that shift is dragged back again. And now you start to sort of find your overall...
My 30s, I stayed up till 4, 5, 6.
Those genetics.
A couple of days still on the road. Now my 40s.
Why has Mother Nature
12, 1 o'clock.
variability? Wouldn't it make sense for
Wake up
us as social species to
before
all
the
be
sun.
synchronized, to all be waking up at the same time and going to sleep
But
at
it's
the
also
same
because
time? Why have that
not in the
variability?
city.
Now, we don't know, but my theory is this. As I mentioned, you are so vulnerable when you're asleep. And if you're getting your 8 hours, you're vulnerable for 8 hours. That's an immense amount of time. What we know from studies of those cultures untouched by electricity is that they co-sleep. They don't all go away to sleep by themselves in a little room. They sleep together with family, other friends.
One up, one down.
Imagine now the scenario if you're a co-sleeping community. Now it starts to make a lot of evolutionary sense. Some people are naturally going to want to go to bed late, let's say 2 a.m. in the morning. And then there are other people who are going to want to wake up, having gone to bed at 9 p.m., at 5 a.m. in the morning, or 6 a.m. in the morning. So now, as a collective, awake until about 2 a.m., and there's always someone awake from 6 a.m. So you are vulnerable now as a collective for only 4 hours rather than 8 hours. You can imagine Mother Nature would never turn away from the opportunity of gaining 50% increased survival fitness, which is the difference between 4 hours of vulnerability versus 8 hours of vulnerability.
One last thing I wanted to ask you, and that is, what keeps you up at night in terms of your research? What do you find most exciting that you just can't go to sleep and related to sleep research?
For me, I think one of the most exciting things right now is the role of sleep in psychiatry. We cannot find a single psychiatric disorder where sleep is normal. Sleep, I think, has a powerful story to tell us, not only in our understanding of psychiatric illness, but also our treatment and maybe prevention of psychiatric disorders. And if you look across medicine, we've done wonderful work in combating things like infectious diseases. Even in cancer, we've made great progress. When it comes to the brain disorders, and particularly the psychiatric disorders, we've made remarkably little progress. We cannot bend the curve of advance and discovery. I think sleep is going to be one of the revelations over the next decade in terms of our understanding of serious mental health illness.
Well, thank you for joining us in conversation, Matt Walker.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've been missing. Will only require one shot and doesn't need to be stored in a specialized freezer. Senior administration officials stress that all 3 vaccines are safe and effective. The company expects to deliver about 20 million doses altogether during the month of March. The company also says it will deliver 100 million doses by the end of June. The Biden administration says that all of the vaccines will continue to be allocated to states and tribes based on population size. Aisha Roscoe, NPR News.
Protests took place across Europe this weekend against continuing coronavirus restrictions. Terry Schultz has
more. Have good efficacy against the B4117.
Over lockdown measures.
But
Amsterdam saw hundreds of people protesting coronavirus restrictions on Sunday. In Dublin, more than a dozen people were brought before a judge Saturday night for their suspected roles in demonstrations turning violent. And in Denmark, there were 8 people arrested at a gathering that swelled to some 1,200 demonstrators.
Terry Schultz reporting. Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, is under a lockdown because of a spike in COVID-19 cases. All bars, restaurants, shopping malls, and schools will be closed until March 15th. Large gatherings of people are also banned. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is apologizing after a second former aide accused him of sexual harassment. NPR's Joel Rose
all you gonna do is apologize, nigga, step down.
With an independent investigation overseen by the state's attorney general.
In a statement, Cuomo acknowledges that his behavior was insensitive and was seen as unwanted flirtation.
So then you acknowledge that you did something wrong, so that means that you need to step down their elected duty.
James. Earlier, the governor's office
Abuse of
proposed
power.
that the attorney general and the state's chief judge appoint an independent investigator jointly. But James rejected that proposal, and Cuomo backed down. 2 former aides have now accused Cuomo of sexual harassment. The second accuser, Charlotte Bennett, says the governor asked inappropriate questions about her sex life. Cuomo says he did ask personal questions, but has denied doing anything inappropriate. Joel Rose, NPR News.
Former President Donald Trump made a major speech today for the first time since leaving office. He spoke to the Conservative Political Action Conference in Orlando, also known as CPAC. Trump criticized his successor, President Biden, and fellow Republicans. He said he didn't plan on trying to start a third political party. This is NPR News.
That's why you bought up all the
Demonstrators in Myanmar are preparing for more protests tomorrow, 1 month after the military seized power in a coup and detained their elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. Violence erupted in several cities in Myanmar today when police opened fire on the protesters after tear gas and warning shots failed to disperse them. At least 18 people were killed.
Damn.
New York's Lincoln Center says it has a new initiative to bring performances back to the complex, which has been closed since last March. It's called Restart Stages. 10 new outdoor performance and rehearsal stages will be created. Jeff London reports.
Lincoln Center is building a cabaret stage, areas for families, rehearsal stages open to the public, a space for public school graduations, and an outdoor reading room for the Library for the Performing Arts. Programming will feature concerts of chamber music and cabaret, film screenings, and dance workshops. Companies from the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens will be artistic partners. Lincoln Center hopes Restart Stages will help, quote, kickstart the performing arts sector and contribute to the revival of New York City. April 7th, World Health Day, is when the new project kicks off with a special performance for healthcare workers. For NPR News, I'm Jeff London in New York.
Baseball spring training games opened today. Seating was limited to comply with COVID-19 restrictions. All 30 major league teams are to begin regular play April 1st. I'm Nora Rom, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations.
Morning, everybody. Sun is up. Solar panels making power. Fancy orders. Getting ready for the gravel to get. Beautiful. Switching this out, but I gotta finish doing the driveway thing.
Today she sat down for her first interview as DNI with our colleague Mary Louise Cummings on the line. Good morning. Good morning. Didn't you sit down with the director as this report was coming out?
Literally within seconds. And I would like to say we planned it that way. We had been working to get this on the calendar with no idea when the report might come. And as it happened, yes, we had driven out. We'd had to surrender our phones because you can't take them into a secure facility. The report still had not dropped. In the end, they handed me a copy moments before Haynes stepped into the room. And luckily, it was a short report, so I could read it quickly and then sit down and ask her about it.
Yeah, and we heard something about that in All Things Considered Friday, but you also had an opportunity to ask more broadly about where the intelligence community goes after 4 years of what was seen as politicized intelligence. What did she have to say?
Well, that was where I wanted to spend most of my time with her because, as you noted, there has been so much turnover. We have seen 5 acting or permanent DNIs during Trump's 4 years as president. There has been so much tension. You may recall, among other moments, in Helsinki, Trump seeming to take Vladimir Putin's word above that of the leaders of his own intelligence agencies. So we talked about that, about whether integrity and independence of intelligence had been damaged. In your view, was intelligence?
Side, and again, it's always hard to tell exactly what's happening from the outside, as if there were political pressures being put on the intelligence community, and putting it aside in a way that was quite
But clearly, that is one of the tasks is how to rebuild trust, how to rebuild morale.
Well, let's talk about another task. We've reported on this program about domestic terrorism, about whether the government is really set up to fight it. And the indications come back. Really, no, they're better set up for international terrorism. What do you have to say about that?
Right, this is tricky. Her entire job, her post, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as you know, was set up after 9/11 in response to 9/11 to fight Al-Qaeda. Now they are looking at this very different threat, and the legal challenges, the intelligence challenges are very different. I want to play you one bit of that part of our interview, and you can hear it is very much a work in progress. Do you think domestic terrorism is now a greater threat than international?
That continues to be just increasing challenge for us, and certainly the racially and ethnically motivated violence that we're seeing is increasing, and we've seen that from the intelligence community over the last few years. I think quite some jarring reports that demonstrate that, and I think trying to understand that and understand how we're going to manage that over the next few years is going to be a particularly challenging effort.
So we talked about that. We talked about January 6th and what intelligence failures may have occurred there, what needs to be done to fix that. And then I asked her about being the first woman. She's the first woman to serve as Director of National Intelligence. And it was very interesting hearing her talk about how important it is for young women to see someone who looks like them. at the helm, especially when intelligence has been so male-dominated since forever.
Mary Louise, thanks.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Mary Louise Kelly talking about her interview with the new Director of National Intelligence, and you'll hear more of that on the program she hosts, All Things Considered, today.
In Houston, some people still do not have water 2 weeks after winter storms took down Texas's electricity grid. Houston is the 4th biggest city in the United States, and some people there wonder how this can possibly be happening. Here's Houston Public Media's Laura Eisensee.
At a mass aid distribution site this weekend, Mayor Sylvester Turner told reporters tens of thousands of Houstonians still don't have running water in their homes.
So even though the power is on, the water pressure is normalized. The reality is that there are literally thousands of homes, including apartments, that have been affected because of busted pipes and they still don't have water.
The city's Public Works Department is trying to figure out exactly how many places the water's not flowing. Plumbers are overstretched and scrambling far and wide to find replacement pipes.
We've made that request on FEMA for more materials and supplies, and the need is so overwhelming.
In Kashmir Gardens, a historically black neighborhood in northeast Houston, Keith Downey has been connecting residents with bottled water and other resources. He's the president of a neighborhood civic group and says many of the seniors he sees have busted pipes they can't fix.
It's disheartening to hear a 100-year-old or a 93-year-old and an 89-year-old. It's heartening to hear of a 40-year-old that can't afford to have their homes repaired.
One elder he's helped is Sylvia Scarborough. She turned 77 on Sunday and has lived in her home in Kashmir Gardens for over 50 years.
I'm exhausted.
When the freeze came, her pipes burst and she lost water. So did her next door neighbor.
So we were having to go down 2 blocks to a neighbor's house and get water.
Her son managed to find a plumber to fix most of the pipes, but there's at least one more leak, and she still doesn't have running water inside her house. For that, she goes to the water main right outside.
So we go out there with the water, turn on it. We turn it on, fill up buckets so that we can use that water to flush the toilet.
Scarborough worries needed resources are not easily available to her neighborhood.
It's been traumatic, but I mean, this isn't the first disaster. Going through Harvey and then all the other hurricanes before them were horrible.
She's still dealing with repairs from Hurricane Harvey more than 3 years after that storm. For NPR News, I'm Laura Eisensee in Houston.
This afternoon on All Things Considered, it turns out that people who have recovered from COVID might only need 1 dose of the COVID vaccine. Listen by asking your smart speaker to play NPR, or just ask for your local station by name.
Depending on what strain he got back there. What strain he caught and which one strain he catch yet. Come on,
This is
Yankees.
NPR News.
It's 7:19. This is Cap Radio, 90.9 Sacramento and 90.5 Tahoe, Reno. Your NPR 50s in
They say
Reno.
it's supposed to be 70 today. How in the hell over the weekend is supposed to get snow? Be careful out there, folks. If we don't get snow, that means they're gonna smack the middle of the middle earth again.
They will. They're home next week.
Hey, this is Nicole Nixon, politics reporter at Cap Radio.
Coming with some bullshit,
Hi, I'm
folks.
Elizabeth
Y'all be
Egger,
safe out there.
reporter for Cal Matters. Together, we provide context to the political
Be
stories
safe,
that
get all we
shape
can
your
do
lives in our
done
new
this week
podcast, California
as
State
best
of
as
Mind.
possible,
And
because
now
some more
we're
bullshit
excited to
coming.
bring those stories to
Anybody on the
Parallel
road?
thinking is
I'm not on
as
the road.
old
I'm
as
in a
this
lockdown
republic.
area. How
And
the fuck am I
stories of
supposed to pay the
conspiracy
same
are now
insurance
spreading
rate?
more widely and more rapidly.
I
NPR's
should
Joel
be
Rose
paying a lower
reports as part
premium.
of our series on disinformation.
They didn't learn nobody's shit.
Millions of people watched the moon
And they're
landing
supposed
live
to.
on TV in
Because ain't
1969.
nobody driving.
Yeah.
And I ain't driving. So my shit should go down. Not fucking stay the same. The class action lawsuit right now, homie.
I don't believe that man can get out of the atmosphere.
This is Bonnie Garland.
As I've been saying, people getting punked all left and right, like I said last year. Watch what happens with the electric thing. That's why you heard entrenched things and
commercials talking about the wear and tear on your house and fucking your power consumption and this and that. It's like, people ain't pushing back going on, man. Dude, you need to pay me for that.
I just always had
Those office buildings, we're paying for that. Now all that's coming to light, what I was speaking on. Along with the insurance thing. You ain't driving, why are you paying the same insurance rate?
Coronavirus and about settled historical facts.
Yeah, there's no way
How they get
$50,000 in your car this year.
How they do Tiger Woods? The little shit they pulled out his car.
Even more falsely believe that mass shootings in recent years were
They put them in cars after they started getting people tricked stupidly to put the little USB thing in there. That's a black box to tell on them, so they get their insurance down. But again, if you look into it, I guarantee there's a lawsuit against insurance companies. If we had one, if there's one for the Hawaiian Buns getting sued, I know there's somebody getting the insurance companies right now, because I know the insurance companies didn't lower your rate, and there wasn't nobody looking into it, so during the heavy lockdowns, your insurance plan should have went down.
Conspiracy theories have
You know what I'm saying?
become more dangerous
Especially when
and
people
more
with the little shits that they
widespread,
stick in their
just
car.
even in the last
I ain't
10
driving,
years.
you're not driving, half of Marysville not driving. Insurance should have went down.
She's written a book about anti-government conspiracy
You know
theories. She
the
says
probability
all the
you
way
getting
back
a
to
wreck
the founding of the
went
country.
way the fuck down.
Until recently, though, Olmsted says
How
it
much
was
money
harder
did they
for
rake
these
in during
ideas
that?
to
You
gain
understand?
traction.
I guarantee
Take
there's
the
a
people
class
who
action
trafficked in
lawsuit somewhere.
conspiracy theories about the assassination of John F. Kennedy in the 1960s.
They had to work pretty hard to identify each other. They would put up flyers at the local library, or they'd write letters to the editor, and eventually they had groups and newsletters, and they would have conferences. I mean, they did it, but it took a while.
Eventually, their fringe ideas did break through to the mainstream, though not until decades later.
And it is the best indication of a massive plot in Dallas.
It's called a movie.
Who could have best done this?
Director Oliver Stone was widely criticized in the 1990s for amplifying these conspiracy theories in the movie JFK, starring Donald Sutherland as a whistleblower and Kevin Costner as the DA who believes there was a cover-up.
Now we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black, and black is white.
These days, conspiracy theories are taking hold much faster.
Social media tends to drive
Hold on a minute.
to the mainstream.
So much shit is called a conspiracy theory when this shit ain't a conspiracy.
Center, where she studies how disinformation
I
spreads
think it's fucked up.
Donovan says the internet gives conspiracy theorists a place to connect, and social media gives them a way to quickly disseminate their ideas on a mass scale.
There's so many conspiracy theories on the internet. The scale is
I
astounding.
got truthful information. I post my shit get took down.
Think about it as an attack
Motherfucker
on the
write some
supply
shit
chain
talking
of
about Santa
information.
Claus is fighting fucking Rudolph with fucking Gandhi stuff or like Godzilla.
Donovan says the truth is under
They
attack
fucking
by
get a
disinformation
million views. I'm
peddlers
like, how
trying
the
to
fuck?
make money or shape a political narrative. And experts say the
That's why
former
I say
president
bullshit on
has
this.
given credibility to these false conspiracies on an unprecedented scale.
This election was rigged, and the Supreme Court.
Oh shit with links. The whole shit. They took my shit down and said
For months, Trump
it
and
goes
his allies
against
have
our
repeated
community
the lie
standards
the
that you're
election was
sharing
stolen.
fucking factual truth, and the whole
Yesterday,
fucking thing
in a
is someone's
speech to
brain dead and
supporters,
can't fucking
polls
search the
indicate
shit
a
for
lot of
themselves.
people have bought into
You got a
this.
whole PowerPoint
Another
series on
Ipsos
it.
poll from January,
No, we're
1
blocking
in
that.
3 respondents falsely believed that voter fraud helped President Biden win the November election. And about a quarter of respondents believed other unfounded conspiracies. That electronic voting machines switched votes from Trump to Biden, or that Democratic cities
Is
and
it
counties
China's fucking
falsified
movies?
their
If you
vote
look,
totals. All of that,
China
Donovan
appears
says,
to
led
warn
to the
India,
insurrection
push too
in the
hard
US
and the
Capitol
lights
on
could go
January
out.
6th.
As
What's
border
dangerous is when people
skirmishing
mobilize
increased
based
last
on
year,
misinformation.
malware began
It
to
doesn't
flow
just
into
put
the Indian electricity
communities in
grid.
danger, it puts law enforcement
And
in
the same
danger as
happening
well.
here. Is
There
the
are
fucking
concerns
move.
about the potential
Attack the
for more
grid.
violence on March 4th. That's the day some followers
China
of the
appears to
baseless
warn
QAnon
India, push too
conspiracy
hard
hope that
and the
Trump will be
lights could go
inaugurated
out.
for a second term and
Well, I told
vanquish
you.
the cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophile elites who
They using
secretly
that
run the
plasma
country.
tech, yo. I
Almost
told you, man.
5,000 National Guard troops remain deployed at the U.S.
Them
Capitol
videos where they
west of
show on the
Washington.
thing on TikTok where they
Historians
show also
Captain
Transformer
Olmsted
that
says
blew
this
up and
is
all
the
that. Why did
culmination
Black
of
Transformer
conspiracy
blew up?
theories and people who believe them growing more extreme since the
Keeps
era
Talk
of JFK.
277.
These conspiracy theories are becoming more all-encompassing, and they are encouraging more people to think that it is
You have to ask yourself, how you gonna knock my
logical and
power out?
necessary to use violence against their government because their government is controlled
Non-conventional
by
weapon.
group of satanic pedophiles.
So, what can we do about this? Experts say social media platforms
Which has now
need to
become
find better ways
conventional.
to
That's why
counter
war has to be
disinformation.
changed.
They also say the situation
The
might improve
non-conventional has
somewhat
become
after the
conventional
pandemic,
in the
when
last
Americans have more
25 years.
real-world
So
interactions
that's
that
how
can
they're
help
hitting
deal
it.
with what they're reading online.
Can't call that
But Olmsted
unconventional
says
anymore.
recent history is not encouraging. Consider the lie that Barack Obama was born outside the U.S.
The birther conspiracy theory
It's
is
like that cricket
depressing
shit.
for people who study conspiracy theories because of
It's
the
like
way that it proved
he
impossible
called
to
the sonic
debunk.
attack
Olmsted
supposed
says, of course,
non-conventional
there's no
weapon
doubt
was the
Obama was
motherfucking
born in
crickets.
Hawaii on
And then you
August
finally
4th,
come out and say it's
1961.
fucking
There's
first
the
getting
birth
their brain
certificate,
microwave.
there's the birth announcements in the newspapers.
That's not
eyewitness
non-conventional anymore.
accounts. It's as
The forefront.
documented as any historical fact.
But for some people,
Let's
all the
reclassify
evidence
things
in the
nowadays.
world will never be enough.
Because how hard is it to put that on a couple of drones and fly over everybody's fucking popcorn? You understand?
This is NPR News.
In the summer of 2018,
Look out, world, when the motherfuckers tried to take out Maduro with the drone. Remember that?
in Maryland, 5 staff
This is
members
a
were
wrap.
killed. The paper's surviving staff now faced a terrible question. What happens next?
I could see the demarking line between my old life and my new life.
That story this afternoon. Considered from NPR News.
Wake up, dude. We gotta get this shit moving quicker. In my head, I need to fucking call in some more fucking soldiers to come and get some shit done here with this. And these fools are changing timelines, bringing more shit in, terraforming us faster. People are succumbing to the shit and giving up whole fucking species for riches. Opening the portals like fucking Contact, and every one of these vials and vaccines is a fucking implementation tag marker for this shit to get inside your body.
For emergency use by the Food and Drug Administration.
Remember, it's Jim that are giving you information to create this.
Dr. Anthony Fauci
Yes,
says he's encouraged to see a third vaccine being made available.
This is a good vaccine. I think we need to pull away from this comparing and parsing numbers until you compare them head to head. Just be really grateful that we have 3 really efficacious vaccines.
You're really grateful we got anything at all.
ABCs this week. The other COVID-19
We stripped the oceans of sharks, and we're feeding you fucking babies, fetal baby tissue, and fucking shark immune system.
Former aide accused him of sexual harassment. Karen DeWitt with New York State Public Radio has more.
How you like that?
Issue a lengthy statement.
You'll be saved, but the oceans are gonna be fucking decimated, so we die either way.
He admits that he's teased people who he works with about their personal lives and relationships. And the governor goes on in his statement to say that he now understands that some of the things he said
So you admit even more
flirtation and that he's truly sorry.
that you dereliction of duty and respect the power of the fucking office you hold.
NPR News from Washington. It's 7:31 with Camp Radio News. I'm Steve Milman. Pacific Gas and Electric customers will see a change in their next utility bill.
We are going to see a rate change.
Yeah, baby. It's called fuck you, nigga.
Lindsay Fallow says average customers
You ain't charging me to burn my house.
by more than $8 a month.
The investments that we'll be making with this money include efforts to really reduce wildfire risk,
Right.
enhancing our vegetation management, adding more technology and tools, including further building out our network of
Better air conditioners in our vehicles while we sit out here and fucking do nothing like the police. Sit with the car fucking disrupted, watching the fucking shit grow.
Even with all the billions of dollars, they're going to keep shutting people off during the wildfire season for at least 10 to 15 years. That makes no sense.
Right. Says PG&E shouldn't be raising rates during a pandemic. Governor has asked the California Public Utilities Commission to adopt a 24-month.
I'm gonna charge you to shut your power off,
Financially because of the coronavirus.
or you can't do shit.
California fire workers lined up yesterday for the coronavirus.
In the last 10, 15 years, everything's gonna be all completely electric. So you can't really do nothing.
Community that's been disproportionately affected by COVID-19.
Except pay the $8 and hope fucking it's not your belt for a blackout.
Fuck you, motherfuckers.
Officials expect to move next.
This is sick, mate, dude.
We're on Facebook as Cap Radio, and you can follow
And
us.
where are the regulators?
Fucking sick, mate, yo.
This is Cap Radio 90.9 Sacramento, streaming at
Sick fucking mate.
capradio.org.
That's sick with it right
and on
there.
the Cap Radio app.
People should raise up and be like, you wouldn't have an infrastructure anyway without our money. Like, fuck you, we need to like own our power. People don't get together and realize that none of the shit in front of their eyes oppressing them would be possible by their means.
Honeybees
They're
pollinate more
fucked.
than 90 other crops across the U.S., starting with almonds, and blooming
Fucking sick,
orchards
man.
provide bees with the 10 amino acids their diets require. More at almondsustainability.org.
Right. There goes all of our water.
Up to 70 in the valley today, upper 40s near Tahoe, and upper 50s in Reno.
This week is the third vaccine authorized in the U.S., but it is the first to require only one shot. On the whole, demand for vaccines so far exceeds the supply of doses available.
And it don't do a motherfucking thing against L452R, R, 501B2, 102RE, REQ, 11E.
3.9 million doses are ready. The vast majority will be allocated to states and local jurisdictions. I spoke to Claire Hannon of the Association of Immunization Managers about all the other distribution channels.
80,000 are going into the retail pharmacy program, so
Or
they're
the
going directly
E.
to the pharmacies. 70,000 doses are going to large-scale
I think
clinic
it's
sites, and then 90,000 doses are going into the FQHCs. So, we should see them going into arms this week.
The FQHCs are the federally qualified health centers, so this certainly helps boost supplies, Noel, but so far about 50 million people in the U.S. have received at least one dose. That's 20% of the population, of the adult population, so the country still has a very long way to go.
Although it's so interesting to see those numbers tick up over time. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine isn't as effective overall at preventing coronavirus illnesses when you compare it to Pfizer and Moderna. We've had reporting on that. Is there any concern that some people might say, no, I want one of the other vaccines?
Why don't you guys,
It is
instead of using such like fucked up verbatim, why don't you classify it into the strains that they were tested against in the population?
Sounds so good, but when infectious disease experts
Actually, like,
keep
talk
saying
properly.
and keep repeating is that this vaccine is very effective at preventing what's most important, hospitalizations
Instead of
and
this
deaths,
fucking
more than 90%. And with supplies so tight, Noel, there just isn't much personal choice here. Your best bet is to take what is
This
available
lip service,
first.
people.
That is
Come on.
the case that Dr. Fauci made yesterday on NBC.
No, this lip
All
service.
three of them are really quite good, and people should take the one that's most available to them. If you go to a place and you have J&J and that's the one that's available now, I would take it. But if I would go to a place where they had J&J, I would have no hesitancy whatsoever to take it.
He says really time is of the essence here. The goal is to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible.
So in the meantime, public health officials are concerned about these new variants that are emerging. And so you've learned that vaccine makers are in the process of
For this
developing
March.
booster shots.
And B117 or the UK or the Kent variant is not fucking taking over America, you motherfucking lying ass motherfuckers.
It's not exactly clear what will be needed, but all the vaccine makers are working on this. The virus has mutated, as we know. We hear about the variants that emerged in South Africa and Brazil. And if you look at the results of the Johnson & Johnson trials, it was studied in South Africa and Latin America and was found to be about 61% to 64% effective against mild to moderate disease. So if the variants from these regions were to spread more, vaccine makers could retool the vaccines to make them more effective. I spoke to infectious disease Dr. Judy Guzman-Cottrell of Oregon Health and Science University about this, and she says exactly what you were saying. Just as the flu virus mutates annually and the vaccine is adjusted annually,
You could envision something similar for the COVID-19 vaccine next winter, where the vaccine covers many different strains or many different spike proteins, so that our bodies make antibodies against different spike proteins, which will cover many variants.
Right.
So the final chapter of vaccinating against coronavirus has not been written, and
That
vaccine
makes no
makers are
sense.
just trying to stay ahead of this.
Let me ask you about some
You
news
just make
that
that
will
thing kill
hopefully be
us.
useful. So the CDC says that people who've been vaccinated should still wear masks and avoid crowds, which has led some people to say, but then what is the point of the vaccine? Can you help with that one?
Because
Sure,
you'll kill the people that ain't got a vaccine.
been vaccinated yet, so lots of people are
You
still
still carry the
vulnerable,
shit.
and at this moment,
Just
it's
like the
still
flu,
not
which they don't tell you, but you should discern and understand that if you get the flu vaccine and you go around someone without a flu vaccine, you infect them.
could play a role in transmission. Now, the risk of this seems quite low given the initial data that's coming in from Israel and elsewhere. Yet, Judy Guzman-Cottrell says the science is still unfolding, so you have to hang tight. So, per the CDC guidance, vaccinated people should continue to mask and take other precautions, such as avoiding crowds.
You do ionic silver flush in your fucking nasal passages. Use a fucking respirator thing. K95 mask, not the fucking N95 mask. It's fucking retarded. Putting a pair of panties on your face and do shit.
That being vaccinated should give us more freedom.
UVC light, you can get 6 watt sterilized shit. Make your own filtration. It's the aerosol people. Cleanse that shit.
Take precautions as she travels and
Get a motherfucking air thing with a mask on it. And albuterol yourself, but not use albuterol. Use ionic silver. Not colloidal, ionic silver. And fucking cleanse your fucking respiratory system. If you go out a lot, have a new person that comes around you, fucking do that, so you don't pass the shit.
It's too soon to lift all the restrictions in place. Certainly too soon to lift mask mandates, as 4 states have done: Montana, Iowa, and North Dakota.
Ionically treat your fucking animals too, so they don't get sick from your fucking animals.
Now, even though it's way down from where it was, it's down to around 70,000. But you've got to get that baseline down lower than it is now, particularly in light of the fact that we have some worrisome variants. So it's really too premature right now to be pulling back too much.
His message is to stay vigilant. And the National Institutes of Health has this new initiative to expand research on long haulers. These are people who get symptoms from COVID that last for months and months. What has their research found?
A new study from the University of Washington found 6 months post-COVID, about a third of people enrolled in their study had lingering symptoms, including fatigue. I spoke to the author of the study, Dr. Helen Shu.
It did surprise us because a lot of the previous studies were done in hospitalized individuals, and so in those studies they did find high rates of persistent symptoms. But ours was a
What's
study that was
their
primarily
leukocyte count
outpatients, so
in
those with
interferon
mild
and
disease
everything?
and were never seen
Give
in
us those
clinics,
counts.
or definitely
I'll be able to tell you why the people start having it and how to cure their ass.
a mild case of coronavirus.
Yet they continue to have these symptoms 6 months later. It's not clear why. She says the next step is to take blood samples, look to see if they can identify a signature, some sort of inflammatory signature, or something else that can explain this.
Just a lot we
What
still
did
don't
you
know.
guys do? You're gonna have to do statistical analysis and see
Support for NPR
medical
health
treatment
coverage comes from Dana-Farber Cancer
similarities and so forth, and look at the prednisones and steroidal injections that were used, immunosuppressants.
For Hodgkin lymphoma, melanoma, and other cancers.
A month after the military coup in Myanmar, the ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi has appealed in court to face new criminal charges.
Even though that Indian doctor hosts this lady, actually dude from California that talked about the Denmark strain here.
Forces on Sunday. Despite that, people have been out on the streets again
Is it genetically specific? The shit that happens to you. I say yes, they say no.
Remain determined despite the upsurge in violence.
Not the best indication to look at the resistance by the
They say no, I say yes.
Go out to the streets every day because we still have a massive civil disobedience movement ongoing. The fact that there are fewer people going out to the streets today doesn't mean the resistance has reduced.
And the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, has been convicted of corruption and influence peddling. He's been handed a 3-year prison sentence, 2 of which are suspended for attempting to bribe a judge involved in a separate corruption investigation against him. The BBC's Lucy Williamson is in Paris.
The evidence convicting him, fiercely challenged by his defense, came from police wiretaps that were part of yet another investigation into whether Mr. Sarkozy had received money from the former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi.
In London, I'm Rich Preston at the BBC.
That's that Hillary Clinton shit right there, boy.
California's revenues are soaring. The state is billions of dollars ahead of its tax collection projections.
Omar Gaddafi fucking sponsored them motherfuckers, dude. And then they come around and had that poor man butt fucked on TV. Set on fire. That's crazy.
Income tax collections in January were $7.5 billion more than projected. Analysts say low-wage workers bore the brunt of the pandemic job losses, while wealthier Californians work from home. The economic losses started at the bottom of the income ladder, and so far they have not made their way up to the top. A young male wolf has been traveling near Yosemite National Park, the farthest south a wolf has been tracked in California in more than a century. Researchers have been monitoring the wolf, dubbed OR93, via his tracking collar, and say the animal departed Oregon earlier this year, likely in search of new territory. After trekking through Modoc County and crossing State Highways 4 and 208, OR93 recently moved into Mono County, just east of Yosemite. Officials say the animal is likely searching for a mate. This is Cap Radio News at 7:45. Rather than letting COVID-19 vaccine doses go to waste, vaccination centers turn to waiting lists, often including people not in priority groups, to receive leftover time-sensitive shots. Cap Radio's Ed Fletcher began a search for an extra dose and spoke with our Mike Haggerty about what he learned.
First off, Ed, have we found a dose yet? I have not. And to be clear, I am not in a priority group and have not been looking real hard, and the county does not recommend people gum up the works by looking for extra doses. That being said, I have learned a lot already and wanted to share some of the resources that I came across. First off, myturnca.gov. It's the official government.
Oh, I gotta get a platform over there situated. I can't wait.
Doses. Everybody should be registered there so you know when your time comes. VaccinateCA.com. That's a crowdsourced resource and sort of
on the
offers
solar
another
collector
level
system,
of searching
we
tools
have,
looking for vaccine shots in
since
addition
we've been
to
up,
myturnca.gov. And then
bathtub
there's
full, hot water, steaming hot water,
idrb.com, and its tagline is "Don't let
coffee made and
doses
everything,
go to
faster
waste."
than
So
stove.
it's looking for clinics that have extra doses and trying to match you up, and it'll send you a text message when a dose becomes available.
That's gonna be the focal point
What
right there.
inspired this quest? I've been perfectly willing to wait my turn, and I still am.
Man, you
But I
got the
recently got
BeeHive
a
over
call
there with
for
solar
brunch from a
collectors.
friend I hadn't seen since much during the pandemic, and she told me that she got her shot. And
Bless the
she's
sun,
my age.
stay over
She
and let us
got a
strike
call.
water.
She had
Get
just a
into
few
the mine
minutes to
shaft
race
so we
across
got
town
infinite
to
water.
get this shot, and
The
she
true
was really
gold
feeling
of this world.
quite lively and excited about the prospect of life after getting a shot.
I understand you talked to some people who were successful.
Spend the rest of
I
our
talked to
money.
a Sacramento resident,
Replicate the solar kit that we got, make a fucking pumping station, sprinkler system, yo. Like, my god, we got 4 months before fire season. I mean, we're in fire season now, but we got 4 months before water stops falling from the sky. It's like, oh my god! Ah! I'm sorry. But I'm like super happy with what we did yesterday. That I'm just like, okay, if I change my motive, and we just sectional it like we just did, we'll get that. We can get all this cleaned up in 4 months.
Well, it's hard to say.
Exactly. Do 2
Instead
trips a
of, as
day.
you seen,
Make sure you do 2 trips a day. Get things out
took
of
me
the
a
way.
week to cut all that down, but because it's all jinged on top of each other,
It keeps getting harder.
it's taking me like a month to cut it away just right there.
And so those doses
I feel like we do it together.
and that's how they kind of
Concentrated group effort,
But the other
sectional,
that the
and
Secretary
get it done easy.
out is
Get
that
things out of the
early
way.
on, when they were just vaccinating healthcare workers,
We're gonna have a live, but I
many of
feel like we
those
could have
healthcare
done a
workers
little trip and take
ended up not
the
showing up
rest,
to
you know.
appointments because they're doing other
I
things
was
like
tired
saving
too.
lives, and they needed places to get these doses into people's arms, but they are discouraging people from
dig a trench, see if it fills in while we do the next thing. Better discern if we actually, well, we're still going to use that as a driveway, but I guess we can use that as a secondary or not.
Groups currently being
Depending on how
prioritized for vaccination,
much
including
water
healthcare workers,
gets in there or
law
not,
enforcement officers, people over
would be if
65
we have
years
to
old,
line that to
teachers,
keep it from getting
and certain
evaporation and try to
vulnerable
figure out how to get
You'll
water
find more
pumped
news
into it.
at capradio.org.
I really want to have something up there
from this station.
so
And
that we
from
have
Morgan Stanley, presenting Thoughts on the Market, their podcast with analysis and perspectives, supported by a global team of researchers.
Senator joins us from Washington. Nancy, what was this fallback plan?
It was Senate Democrats' Plan B for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The Senate parliamentarian said last week a straight-out wage hike wouldn't comply with the guidelines that Democrats have to follow in order to fast-track the legislation, and that prompted some Senate Democrats to come up with this Plan B to raise the minimum wage through tax penalties and incentives. But now it looks like they won't go with this plan because it would be so hard to implement and enforce.
So what happens now?
The House passed the COVID relief bill over the weekend, as you probably heard, and sent it to the Senate. The Senate is expected to vote on the legislation this week. I talked to George Washington University political science professor Sarah Binder about whether any expensive amendments will be added to the Senate bill.
If you want to add money to the bill, you have to find a way to pay for it. And that's tricky in this short time period and to legislate on the floor like that. So I suspect there'll be enormous pressure on Democrats to stick together to get this bill done.
Pressure. So Nancy, what's the timeline?
It's tight, David. Democrats want to pass the relief bill and get it signed into law in the next few weeks. That's because the legislation includes an extension of a weekly federal unemployment benefit, which is set to expire in mid-March.
Nancy, thank you. At the Conservative Political Action Conference in Orlando over the weekend, former President Trump was clear he will not start a new party to make an end run around his grand old party. He dropped strong hints he might like to run for president again. There was some interest also in Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem. And Trump is still very good at raising money. Marketplace's Amy Adams has that.
Former President Trump never stopped raising money. First, he pulled in cash from donors to fight his election loss.
Motherfucker just milking me.
Trump launched a leadership PAC that raised over $30 million just in a matter of months.
Carl Evers Hillstrom monitors money in politics for
Fucking tip of the year, man.
And he says politicians and groups who align themselves with Trump are benefiting as well.
The Republican Party is increasingly reliant on Trump to actually raise money. So we've seen some corporate interests are not as interested in donating to them after the Capitol riot.
Trump's supporters, on the other hand, still seem game to donate to the president and his allies. There were even rumors that
They eat, drink, sleep, shit. Fucking Trump.
And what he's done is actually a lot more interesting.
Jennifer Herwig is
They
a political
need to
sociologist at SUNY.
shut down this media
He
empire.
said, okay, I have this kind of asset, which is my fundraising prowess and my donor list and the ability to connect with people who maybe ordinarily wouldn't donate. And so I'm going to use that and turn it into a formal organization that the GOP has to pay attention to.
And the Republican Party is.
We know that President Trump is still someone who is wildly popular and someone who was and is an effective fundraiser.
Paris Denard is a spokesperson for the Republican National Committee.
We are optimistic that he will continue to be the type of former president that
Calling
engages
and robbing old people and shit like that. People that are dying or something.
Trump has agreed to attend an RNC donors event this spring in Florida, where Republican leaders will be encouraging donors and the former president to support their efforts heading into the midterm elections. In Washington, I'm Kimberly Evans for Marketplace.
The bond market is not tanking like last week, which moderates interest rates and chases money back into stocks. The Dow at the moment up 689 points, 2.2%. The S&P is also up 2.2%. The Nasdaq is up 2.3%. There's news today the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, has been convicted of corruption. He's sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he'll have to serve just one of those years. Either won't work out for him. Bribing an magistrate
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where research on how cancer cells get oxygen led to development of
came
kidney
from
cancer
him investigating
and
Gaddafi.
complications for heart disease.
Hillary Clinton involved in that.
Danafarber.org/everywhere. And
in, day out during pandemic, like posing for a yearbook photo for an hour at a time, 5 times a day. Gentle fake smile glued to your face, feigning interest with ears cocked like a Doberman Pinscher who thinks he hears the mailman. It is not just you. There is fresh, peer-reviewed research out of Stanford that Zoom fatigue is real. From our workplace culture desk,
It's
Marketplace
called screen fatigue of dosimetry, radiation.
Today at a virtual conference recently, Chicago biologist Becca Weinberg is done with
Electromagnetic
radio
frequency radiation. Fatigue, people, come on, wake up.
She says it makes social interactions
It's called radiation. You need to structure electricity and filter it like I made.
There's a reason for that.
And you won't have that feeling. It will actually give you a whole different feeling, won't it, honey?
Looked right at us for the entire elevator ride at close up.
He says the default display on many programs makes faces appear closer than we're used to, with unavoidable sustained eye contact that can be unnerving, not to mention being constantly confronted with our own faces.
When you look at yourself, you evaluate yourself. And
You
evaluating yourself for 8 hours a day.
Oh my God!
Because turning off self-view and shrinking down the video
Fuck.
window can make interactions feel more natural, less emotionally taxing. And he reminds people that just because
Yeah,
they
do
can
eye
use
contact.
video
I can look
doesn't mean
away
you
from
have
the
to.
screen while I
I'm
look
Megan
at the
McCurdy-Guino
screen.
for Marketplace.
You look at another screen? Like I wonder if the motherfucker was in the room with me.
Behind a V for Vendetta mask, or maybe the one from Scream, to see if that makes me feel any better. I'm David Roncaccio with the Marketplace Morning Report.
The only thing, I talk shit
From
on those
8 p.m.
people,
American Public
but I
Media.
fucking fear for the next
And
generation
you know,
of those
media
people's
people
kids.
were always worried about the lighting and the makeup. From
I'm saying
Sacramento
her.
State, this is listener-supported Capital Public Radio,
Next
90.9
generation.
KXJZ, FM and HD Sacramento.
That's what they getting led to.
capradio.org on your smart speaker and on the Cap Radio app. We get support from 3 by Berkshire Hathaway.
Climate scientists are trying to figure that out using handwritten records from the 19th century. 2 former aides accused New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo of harassment. He's asked for an independent investigation. We remember people who died of COVID and the music they loved, and a devoted son fights to get coronavirus vaccines to Africa to protect his mom and others. It's Monday, March 1st. Lupita Nyong'o is 38 today. And the news is next.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. Congressional Democrats have abandoned a backup proposal to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. NPR's Aisha Roscoe explains.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders had proposed imposing tax penalties on big companies that don't raise their minimum wage, but our colleague Susan Davis is reporting that Senate Democrats are abandoning that effort after facing some resistance. Stripping out that $15 minimum wage may actually make the rescue package easier to pass.
The minimum wage effort was part of President Biden's nearly $2 trillion relief package now working through Congress. Drug maker Johnson & Johnson says it is starting to ship its newly authorized COVID-19 vaccines out today. NPR's Allison Aubrey reports with a third COVID vaccine in the U.S., demand still exceeds the current supply.
Nearly 4 million doses of the one-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine are ready and will be allocated to states and local jurisdictions. Some doses will go directly to retail pharmacies, mass vaccination sites, and to federally qualified health centers who could make it into arms this week. So far, about 20% of the adult population in the U.S. has received at least one shot, and 25 million people have received both doses. But many more who are eligible are still waiting. More mega sites at stadiums and civic centers are set to open, and supplies are expected to expand in the coming weeks. Johnson & Johnson is expected to deliver 100 million doses by June. Allison Aubrey, NPR News.
Israel's Supreme Court is ending the country's mass surveillance program to track coronavirus infections through cell phone data. NPR's Daniel Estrin reports from Jerusalem.
The Shin Bet spy agency has used cell phone data to track when Israelis come in contact with a virus carrier. Text messages order them to quarantine. Israeli privacy advocates and some health experts opposed the surveillance program. Some Israelis said they received text messages in error. Israel's Supreme Court said it didn't want this spying to become permanent. One judge compared it to Big Brother and said Israel was the only Western democracy to use a clandestine spy agency in the fight against the coronavirus. The court said contact tracers are more effective at tracking infections. Now Israel may only use cell phone surveillance on those who refuse to cooperate with contact tracers. NPR News, Jerusalem.
Iran is rejecting a meeting with the U.S. and European countries to discuss reviving the 2015 nuclear agreement. Iran's foreign ministry says now is not the right time. The Iranian statement says that's due to actions by the U.S. and 3 European powers that did not specify 41 points, or more than 2%. The NASDAQ is up 300 points. You're listening to NPR.
It's 8:04 with Cap Radio News. I'm Steve Milne. California's vaccine appointment system is built around a website called My Turn, but it may not be accessible for some Californians without broadband, especially seniors. Joe Hayes is a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California.
Statewide, 20% of seniors don't have access to broadband at home. By demographics, for instance, access we found is lower Latino seniors, and in rural areas it's 30% that lack access to broadband at home.
He says the state may be able to use recently allocated federal funding to bridge the digital divide among its seniors. California is also offering a telephone hotline for appointments in multiple languages to help Californians without internet access. Starting today, if you have a COVID-19 vaccine appointment, you can get a free ride on Sacramento Regional Transit buses and light rail trains.
To ride for free, customers just need to show their COVID-19 vaccine appointment confirmation.
SAC-RT's Jessica Gonzalez says that could be an email, a text, or a vaccine card.
So you can either print that out or show that right there on your smartphone, and that will serve as valid fare on the date of your appointment.
The transit agency is offering the free rides for the next 3 months, but Gonzalez says they may extend it past the end of May if there's a need. And she has this reminder: everyone who rides transit is required to wear a mask or face covering. Starting today, Yolo Bus is also offering the free rides to vaccination appointments. Their free rides will last through June. The California Air Resources Board is seeking to eliminate agricultural burning in the San Joaquin Valley by the year 2025. The San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District has been reducing the practice since 2013, and that has cut ag burning by 80%. The Air Resources Board wants to bring that number down to 0 to promote public health and meet federal air quality standards. Dave Edwards is with the Air Resources Board. He says orchards and vineyards account for 90% of what's burned in the valley. He says there are other options.
There's soil incorporation, and more recently through some pilot programs that the San Joaquin District have offered, there's been the use of what's called whole orchard recycling, where you're able to basically chip and grind a whole orchard or vineyard.
Edwards says microscopic particulate matter from smoke contributes to ozone, increased asthma cases, and other health factors. You'll find us on Twitter at Cap Radio News.
Support for Cap Radio News comes from Clipper Creek, a local electric vehicle charging station manufacturer. Learn more about charging at clippercreek.com. It's 23 degrees at Tahoe, 30 in Reno, 48 in the valley.
We got the turbo on.
Around 70 in the lower elevations. Close to 50.
Considers whether Arizona law violates them. The House votes on a Democratic bill to expand voter access. And Republicans, who control most state legislatures, want to tighten access. Republicans hope to reshape future elections based on their false claims about the 2020 vote. Even as Donald Trump was trying to overturn that Democratic election last fall, his ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, went on Fox News and spoke of mail-in ballots, which have been used securely for years, but were used more by Democrats.
Mail-in balloting is a nightmare for us. So if we don't fight back in 2020, we're never going to win again presidentially. A lot's at stake here.
In a separate Fox appearance, Graham repeated false claims about mail-in ballots and predicted Republicans would crack down in the future.
If we don't do something about voting by mail, we're going to lose the ability to elect a Republican in this country.
Republicans lost control of the Senate, limiting Graham's power to follow up. But Republicans still control many state legislatures, and many are considering bills to change voting laws based on the falsehoods of 2020.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you being here today. There are a couple of bills on...
Georgia's Republican-dominated House of Representatives held hearings on a plan for multiple new rules.
There has been controversy regarding our election system.
So Chairman Barry Fleming introduced House Bill 531.
An attempt to restore
Panel's gonna get it till 9.
He said Democrat Stacey Abrams criticized Georgia voting after losing a governor's race in 2018. She successfully pushed for greater voter access, and now Republicans want changes of their own.
The biggest one would limit early voting to no more than 17 days.
Stephen Fowler of Georgia Public Broadcasting covers elections in the state, and he says big Democratic-leaning counties used to do more days than that to manage their big populations.
They're talking about making things uniform. Georgia has counties, which is second only to Texas. And there are some counties that have as many voters as maybe a small neighborhood in Atlanta. And this would treat all of them the same, which would tend to make it harder for the bigger, more urban, more democratic metro counties to account for everyone and get them through the early voting process, especially if vote by mail is restricted like some other measures in the legislature.
Voting on weekends would also be harder to schedule, affecting Souls to the Polls events that black churches hold on Sundays. The legislature is considering other bills. The state Senate last week passed Senator Larry Walker's plan to add an ID requirement to request an absentee ballot.
97% of the registered voters have either a driver's license number or a personal ID number issued by the state of Georgia.
Walker's bill is less dramatic than some, and he says it's a basic reform. Though as the Senate voted, Democratic Senator David Lucas tearfully said it would keep some people from voting.
Every last one of the election bills about the election didn't turn out the way y'all want, and you want to perpetuate the lie that Trump told.
The nonprofit Brennan Center is tracking proposals like Georgia's across the country.
Hi, it's Mirna. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing okay. Thank you. So we called Mirna Pettis of its voting rights team. We'd heard the Brennan Center had counted 106 bills to restrict voting. By the time we got on the line with Pettis, the number had grown. You looking it up now?
When we did the update on February 8th, that we're at 165 bills.
165 bills?
Restricted bills, yep.
After we spoke, the number rose again to more than 250, concentrated in competitive states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Texas. What are some of these bills proposing to do?
In a very discernible and disturbing pattern, we see many of the bills restricting mail voting, and they do it in different ways. We've seen bills that would introduce witness requirements, limit the use of drop boxes, or increase poll watcher access of these ballots.
Philadelphia elections are crooked as a snake. Why are they shutting people out?
The Atlanta machine is corrupt. The machine in Detroit is corrupt.
What I think was really obvious and really upsetting about the 2020 election was that there was very little attempt to hide the racialized nature. I mean, where did we hear that there was impropriety happening? In very diverse cities, in places like Detroit, places like Atlanta. And what sort of attacks did we see? We saw attacks on methods of participation that had been used by older white voters for a very, very long time.
And now that everybody else gets to, we gotta take it away.
By older white voters that suddenly became...
Vote by mail.
Republicans who favor voting changes include many who signed on to efforts to overturn last year's election.
Hey, it's Buddy Carter. Today we're asking the Supreme Court to...
This video shows Republican Congressman Buddy Carter of Georgia, who supported a lawsuit last December.
chip in to assure that we get fair and free elections.
The Supreme Court dismissed the suit. On January 6th, Carter, like most House Republicans, voted to object to the results in several states, even after rioters attacked the Capitol. We called to ask what he's thinking now. Do you accept that Joe Biden won Georgia?
I do, and I have been very clear and concise on that. President Biden was the victor in the state of Georgia. There's no question about it, in my mind. Anyway, I know that there are those who,
But in the other states,
question
no.
that. I am not one of those. I don't believe that there was voter fraud.
Doesn't believe there was fraud, but he still says he's concerned about how Georgia applied its election laws. Why do you think it was that every single court case failed?
Well, that's, you know, that we do have a judicial process, and that was followed. And I can't say specifically as to each one, but what I'm talking about is specifically voter confidence and constituents having confidence in the voting system, that there is integrity in the system. Just because a court has ruled against it doesn't mean that people still should have confidence in it.
Many voters don't have confidence because President Trump falsely claimed fraud. Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, rejected Trump's demand to, quote, find just enough votes for Trump to win.
Look, we need only 11,000 votes. We have far more than that as it stands.
But the Deputy Secretary of State, Jordan Fuchs, says some voters still buy Trump's claims.
I have a Facebook feed of individuals who
don't trust the voting machines. You know, the state turned blue. It was a shock to a lot of folks.
Fuchs is Republican and used to work as a consultant for Buddy Carter, the Georgia congressman. She says she was surprised to learn last fall that he was among those questioning the election results.
He slowly became attached to this rhetoric that the election had been stolen. And so it was shocking to see him latch onto disinformation so quickly.
Fuchs says Georgia's repeated audits and recounts found 2 absentee ballots cast by dead people. 2 out of about 5 million total votes cast in Georgia. The Secretary of State's office is prepared to back reforms, she says, but only if they make sense.
Our office is going to support sound election administration focused legislation. That's it. We need to move into a narrative where you're not attacking election administrators for your loss, you're attacking the more traditional route. Maybe blame, yourself for not fundraising enough, but blaming it on the voting machines or blaming it on a process needs to end.
Some conservatives fear that attacking the process is the point. One of them is Charlie Sykes.
When the idea of voter ID first came up, I thought it was simply a common sense measure to assure voter integrity. I think in retrospect, you look back on it, and this was part of a larger pattern of trying to keep the number of minorities, young people, away from the ballot box.
Sykes is a writer and talk show host who was influential among Republicans until 2016. That's when he was ostracized for criticizing Trump.
Rather than celebrate the massive voter turnout that we saw, they want to dial that back. So they're going to be pushing restrictions on mail-in voting. They're going to be pushing restrictions on voter ID to make sure that the wrong people don't vote again.
How much do Republicans talk about the demographic change in this country and what it means to them?
I think they think about it all the time. And I think that drives a lot of it. I think they see the country slipping away from them, and a lot of that is, in fact, the demographics. They understand that a party based on white identity is going to be doomed if, in fact, they don't find ways to circumvent that.
So this is a pro-Trump party still.
Yes.
Is this an anti-democratic party at this point? Small d democratic?
Yes. This is one of the most troubling developments
And big D.
in Republican politics, especially from my point of view as a conservative.
They don't want democracy.
Because,
they want
over the last
authoritism.
4 years, there seems to be a trend toward embracing or at least tolerating different forms of extremism, including anti-democratic authoritarianism.
We put Charlie Sykes' concern to Buddy Carter, the Georgia congressman who supports changes to voting laws. This may be a statement you disagree with, I don't know, but I think you should have a chance to respond to it. I was talking to Charlie Sykes. He reviews the events of the last few months, and he sees a very big part of the party objecting to the results of a Democratic election, and now moving on to tighten voting rules in certain ways. And he thinks that Republicans are feeling outnumbered and giving up on democracy. Are you?
Look, I'm the eternal optimist, and I try to see the best in everything. I do know that there are a number of Republicans who are very concerned. I had a meeting this morning with one of my strongest supporters and long-time supporters.
They think they're going to be replaced by some weirdo fucking fictitious person. Boogeyman.
Very concerned about the future of our party, but of the future of our country. And that's why what the Georgia State Legislature is doing right now is extremely, extremely important.
Republican officials maintain they are pushing to change voter laws at the urging of Republican voters. Those voters are following the lead of the ex-president, who is still a dominant figure in the party. He's the president who tried
People
for
can
months
send
to overturn
energetic
the
waves and patterns through malware programs through your house
political
electrical system and
process
change you. The screen fatigue people are talking about, they don't realize it's them getting fucking programmed, dude.
It's 8:19.
Epigenetically.
This is Cap Radio 90.9
Lily white
Sacramento
pattern and
and
shit.
90.5 Tahoe. Happening. To answer that with some degree of precision, climate scientists are digging into these dusty handwritten archives. Here's NPR's Lauren Summer.
Just off the coast of Liverpool, England, there's a small windswept island known as Hilbre Island. No one lives there now, but in the late 1800s, a handful of people did. They ran a telegraph lives close to Hilbrey Island, where the remains of those buildings still are. He's also a data scientist at the Permanent Service for Mean Sea Level, an organization that gathers ocean data worldwide. That's where those old tidal records are now kept, along with others, like from the port of Liverpool. To help ships dock safely in the 1800s, workers there dutifully wrote down tidal data every 15 minutes in huge handwritten tables.
You can see some of them had a very intricate handwriting, and other ones are pretty squirrely as well. So.
Altogether, it's tens of thousands of pages of extremely detailed scientific data.
We've never got them off the ledgers, so they're not in a digital format at the moment for us to use in our research.
Matthews is hoping to make it usable. He's posted them on a site called Zooniverse, so volunteers can help. With many people stuck at home, he's hoping they'll pitch in with the transcription online. And it's not just about historical preservation. The data is crucial to understanding climate change because it sets the baseline.
One of the really difficult things of sea level rise is that it happens everywhere on a different base.
Thomas Friedrich
So it's
says
a
sea
baseline.
level rise at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He says oceans are rising because glaciers are melting. So are the ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland. The oceans are also warmer, and warmer water expands. So sea level could rise between 3 and 6 feet by the end of the century. But it'll be slightly different in every city.
Sea level rise is not rising everywhere with the same speed. Like, for example, the US East Coast has seen a lot of sea level rise.
It's not like a bathtub where the water rises evenly. The Earth's crust is slowly changing all the time. A huge weight, like a massive ice sheet, pushes the crust down. When the ice melts, the Earth slowly rebounds, kind of like a cushion when you get off the couch. Friedrichs says historical records reveal how these processes work, and that's key for forecasting future sea levels in different parts of the world.
If we don't have that information, it's easy to be like a few feet off if we don't have local records of sea level.
There's a problem, though. Most of the historical records are from the US and Europe.
The southern hemisphere, it's really well covered.
Locality is technical secretary of the Naval Hydrographic Service of Argentina. He's been working to recover historical records from the port of Buenos Aires to help fill in the gap of data from the southern hemisphere. On some papers, the ink is already fading.
These observations are unrepeatable. So if we don't recover them, it's difficult to understand what has happened.
In Cameroon in Central Africa, tidal data is in the archives of former colonizers. As colonial powers extracted resources from African countries, they kept detailed maritime records. PhD student Yannick Fossifotsi is piecing together records from when Germany and France took control of Cameroon, starting in the late 1800s.
Et cela ne peut pas se faire juste avec quelques stations.
You can't accurately predict sea level worldwide without records from African countries, he says. But he's also hoping the data will provide a clearer forecast for his own country. Douala, the economic capital, already experiences extreme floods. To prepare a city of millions for sea level rise, they'll need detailed local forecasts, informed by records from the past. Lauren Summer, NPR News.
More than 513,000 people have now died in the United States of COVID-19. NPR is remembering some who lost their lives by listening to the music that they loved and also hearing their stories. We're calling our tribute songs of remembrance. Here's Anne and
So good, but what infectious disease experts keep saying and keep repeating is that this vaccine is very effective at preventing what's most important, hospitalizations and deaths, more than 90%. And with supplies so tight, there just isn't much personal choice here.
NPR's Allison Aubrey reporting. The U.S. envoy to Afghanistan is meeting with officials in Kabul today. NPR's Dia Hadid reports Zalmay Khalilzad is trying to shore up Afghan peace talks and keep a deal between the U.S. and the Taliban on track.
Khalilzad's visit, after months away from the region, is a gesture to Afghans that the Biden administration is closely following Afghan peace negotiations, and it signals that the Biden administration is following the fate of the U.S. Taliban deal. The administration is pressing the Taliban to meet the conditions of that deal, including not harboring foreign militants and not attacking provincial Afghan cities.
This is NPR News.
31 with Cap Radio News. I'm Steve Milne. Gas prices in the Sacramento area have gone up by nearly 13 cents in the past week. Gas Buddy says the average price per gallon is now $3.60. Stockton's current average of $3.43 is up by 13.5 cents, and the national average of $2.72 is up 7.5 cents. Analysts say demand for gas is soaring as COVID-19 cases continue to drop and people start filling up more. If you have a COVID-19 vaccine appointment but don't have a way to get there and get home again, Sacramento Regional Transit is offering free rides.
This begins today, and it's available for all transit options that SACRT provides.
SACRT's Jessica Gonzalez says to ride for free, passengers need to show an appointment confirmation in the form of an email, text, or vaccine card. That serves as valid fare only on the date noted in the appointment confirmation. Gonzalez says they'll be offering the free rides for the next 3 months.
You do have the opportunity to extend it past the end of May, and so as we get closer to that date, we'll take a look.
date on there and riding for free.
We also want to remind anyone riding transit that a mask or a face covering is required at all times.
The free rides include all vaccination sites within SACRT's service area, including hospitals, pharmacies, and other immunization locations. YOLO Bus is also offering the same service to its customers. The free rides begin today and will continue through June. You'll find us on Facebook as Cap Radio.
This is Cap Radio, 90.9 Sacramento, streaming at capradio.org. Accusing him of workplace harassment. He has asked for an independent investigation into those allegations. Cuomo is taking heat from a lot of sides these days. He's under pressure about his management style and also how he's handled the pandemic in New York. Karen DeWitt is a reporter with New York State Public Radio and has been following this one. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning.
Tell me about Charlotte Bennett, the second woman who came forward.
Well, she's 25. She worked as an executive assistant and health policy advisor to the governor. Bennett's account was first reported in the New York Times. She says last spring, during the height of the pandemic in New York, when the governor made several unwelcome advances towards her. She said the governor, who's single and 63 years old, also asked her whether she would consider sleeping with older men. Now, Bennett found that talk pretty unsettling. She did complain about the incident at the time to two female supervisors. They agreed to place her in a new job at the opposite end of the state capitol from where the governor's office is located. She later left that job.
And the first woman to come forward, Lindsay Boylan, what does she say?
Well, Boylan, another former aide, she accused the governor of kissing her without her permission during another private meeting in the governor's office and of asking her during a business trip on his private plane whether she wanted to play strip poker with him.
Has Cuomo responded?
Well, yeah, he's denying that he did anything wrong, but he did issue a lengthy statement on Sunday evening saying that while he never intended to offend anyone or cause any harm, he admits that he's teased people who he works with about their personal lives and relationships. And the governor in his statement goes on to say that he now understands that some of the things he said were misinterpreted as unwanted flirtation and that he's truly sorry about that. But he says he never inappropriately propositioned or touched anyone.
Cuomo often defends himself and his supporters defend him by saying, it's New York politics, it's rough and tumble, it's just different here. What are other state lawmakers saying about these allegations?
Well, they don't completely agree with that. Nearly every top Democrat and Republican office holder, state and federal, say the allegations need to be taken very seriously. They're calling for an independent investigation. Now, the state's Attorney General, Letitia James, she wanted immediately to appoint a special investigator with full subpoena powers. After initial attempts by Cuomo to conduct a less formal investigation, the governor finally agreed late last night. He says he and his staff will now cooperate fully with the Attorney General.
Okay, now in the meantime, he is also under pressure for not being honest with the public about how many people died of COVID-19 in nursing homes in the state.
That's right, and it was the Attorney General who issued a report in late January that found the governor's administration had undercounted the nursing home deaths by 50% because he didn't release the number of deaths of residents who became sick with COVID, were transferred to a hospital, and passed away there. That set off a firestorm of criticism. Now he's under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office of Eastern New York. And remember, this was the governor who became sort of a folk hero for his widely watched daily briefings during the height of the pandemic in New York last spring, where he calmly offered facts and science. He told stories about his family, even won an Emmy.
And now are there real questions about his political...
The motherfucker won an Emmy,
Well,
yo?
there are. Republicans, they're in the minority party in the legislature, and even a few Democrats are calling for him to resign or even to be impeached. If Cuomo
Cuomo
He
won
won't
an
be the
Emmy
first
for that
governor in
bullshit
recent
ass
state
lie.
history to resign over a sex scandal. Former
Cuomo
Governor
won
Elliot's
an
sister
Emmy
had to
for
leave
all them
office in 2007 after he was outed for
telecom
patronizing
conference shit.
prostitutes. If the governor can stay, he'll be severely weakened. For a year now, he's had extraordinary emergency powers under the pandemic. He can close down and open businesses and schools, decide who gets the vaccine and when. It's likely that the legislature is going to move to curb those powers in the coming days.
Karen DeWitt of New York State Public Radio. Karen, thanks for your reporting. We appreciate it.
The world's richest countries bought nearly all the early doses of the COVID-19 vaccines even before the vaccines were approved. As we've been reporting, some less wealthy countries, including many in Africa, are struggling to make sure they're not left out. For one expert, the effort is intensely personal. NPR's Narit Eisenman reports.
When the pandemic first hit, Hitesh Hirchand had one overriding concern. How do I protect my mother? He'd fall into these bouts of despair.
Oh my god. It was, I mean,
It's called Mink Plasma, nigga.
it was like every other day.
Make
Hirchand
your own
lives in
stuff.
Boston. His mother, Tulja, was in South Africa. A widow living at an assisted living
Non-locality,
facility. She also
unified
had
field.
diabetes,
Fact, not theory.
hypertension, heart issues.
Yeah, so she had a suite of health problems.
But Hirchand happened to have deep experience in a very relevant field. He's an epidemiologist and expert on setting up pharmaceutical supply chains in low and middle income countries. So Hirchand threw himself into a series of coronavirus logistics projects for Africa. This was how he was going to cope with his anxiety over his mother.
I was doing things at a macro level, but in the hope that to get things right, and one day I could just get on the plane and go back and see her.
He worked with his employer, the United Nations World Food Program, on getting protective gear to Africa. Then, when it became clear that the world could not be relied on to ensure Africa got its fair share of vaccines, Hirchand took on a second, unpaid role, advising the African Union on how to buy vaccines directly. Every day at 5 a.m., he'd take calls with those officials. And he'd call his mother.
You know, telling my mother, like, please wear a mask, and, you know, the vaccines are coming.
And Tulja, his mother, she knew what Hirchand was doing was important, even if she didn't understand all the details.
My mom grew up very poor, extremely poor. She didn't make it past, like, elementary school. She wasn't allowed to go to school.
But all her life, Tulja had this irrepressible spirit. Blocked from education, she channeled her energy into becoming an incredible home cook. Her specialty was this red bean dish from her Gujarati Indian heritage.
It's very savory and spicy, and with, like, naan or rice, it's just amazing.
Also, says Hirchand,
You know, she had this incredible faith in a higher power.
As the months went by, over and over again, she'd tell Hirchand, don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. By New Year's Eve, Hirchand was starting to believe it. The African Union's negotiations with vaccine makers were progressing. His mother was still COVID-free. Then, on January 3rd at 1 a.m., Hirchand got the call he'd been dreading. Tulja had tested positive. He raced to help.
Desperate phone calls to, you know, see if we could get her access to a hospital.
But South Africa was in the throes of a COVID surge. Hospital after hospital turned her away. No
I might
beds.
was infected then.
Within 3 days, Tulja was gone. She was 76. Hirchand is still coming to
Mother
terms.
denied.
I worked so hard.
Service didn't go to the
I
hospital.
worked so hard to make sure that we could get stuff right for South Africa.
But he says, I couldn't solve this for my mother. Narit Eisenman, NPR News.
Tomorrow on Morning Edition, how prepared was the FBI for the attack on the U.S. Capitol? We look ahead to FBI Director Christopher Wray's testimony before Congress.
On Syria has revealed that detention and disappearances have continued throughout the 10-year conflict, and that the fate of tens of thousands of people remains unknown. The BBC's Imogen Folks is in Geneva.
All sides in Syria's conflict have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, the report concludes, while Islamic State's treatment of the Yazidi community amounts to genocide.
India has begun the second phase of its ambitious bid to vaccinate 300 million people by August. Our correspondent says India is trying to speed up the vaccination effort.
What they're doing now is to try and get private healthcare involved. So some private facilities are being allowed to administer the vaccine. They're being allowed to charge people a fee of around $3.
Yogita Lamaye. And China is being accused of impeding the work of foreign reporters working in the country by using new surveillance measures and restrictions first imposed for the coronavirus pandemic. Our Asia-Pacific editor is Celia Hatton.
In the first half of last year, at least 18 international reporters were expelled from China. Those that remain say they're subjected to extreme levels of harassment, with physical attacks, threats to sources, and office break-ins on the rise, though Beijing has dismissed those claims.
In London, I'm Sarah Hawkins at the BBC.
With Cap Radio News, I'm Steve Milne. Health officials in Nevada yesterday reported 266 new confirmed COVID-19 cases, but no additional deaths. The latest numbers bring the total cases to 293,754 since the pandemic began, with the known death toll remaining at 4,957. Meanwhile, Nevada's test positivity rate continues to decline. The state's test positivity rate fell below 10% on February 20th and has continued to drop since January 14th, coming in at 7.6%.
The tests aren't picking up the mutation.
California farm workers lined up yesterday for the coronavirus vaccine at a mobile clinic that organizers hope will be a model for outreach to a community that's been disproportionately affected by COVID. Santa Clara County officials say more workers are expected to get shots on Wednesday at the Monterey Mushrooms facility in Morgan Hill. County officials expect to move next to Gilroy. This is Cap Radio News. It's 8:45. Starting today, Pacific Gas Electric Company is raising electricity rates by 8%.
For the average residential customer, the monthly energy bill increase is approximately $8.73.
As PG&E's Lindsay Paolo, the utility company will use the funds to update outdated equipment blamed for igniting catastrophic wildfires.
We know that it's not easy to pay more, especially right now during this public health and economic crisis, and so that's why we offer nearly a dozen forms of assistance, as well as resources for using less energy.
But even with those resources, consumer advocates say PG&E should hold off on any rate hikes. I spoke with Mark Toney. He's executive director of the Utility Reform Network, or TURN, based in San Francisco.
This is absolutely the worst time to be increasing people's bills when so many people are out of work because of the pandemic. And the usage going up because you're forced to be at home. That's why we have called upon the Public Utilities Commission to adopt a 24-month rate freeze to give people a chance to get back on their feet.
This rate hike was approved by the commission, and it's expected to bring in more than $1 billion to PG&E. Now, the utility company says it needs that money to update outdated equipment, but what do you say to, skeptics?
What have they been doing the last couple of fucking 100 years?
Forced to pay more when PG&E has seemingly neglected to use that money that was allocated earlier for those kinds of expenses.
Turn has made exactly that argument, that so much of the work that PG&E is doing now is catch-up. Even though they're getting more and more money, when you look at the federal court judge, Judge Alsop, he has found that they're not spending the money correctly. PG&E says that even with all the billions of dollars, they're going to keep shutting people off during the wildfire season for at least 10 to 15 years. People expect if we are paying more money for wildfire safety, we should get more wildfire safety in return, and that means they need to stop these public safety shutoffs.
Well, how does California compare with other states when it comes to electricity rates per kilowatt hour?
California has some of the highest rates in the country.
That's why it's better to just spend the money on a year's worth of motherfucking PG&E and free yourself with the court.
More moderate climate than they do in Massachusetts or what.
Solarize your house.
But the
And other
fact
things
is
as
that
such.
a utility bill is part of a bundle. Nobody pays a standalone utility bill unless you live in a home. And if you look at the cost of housing in California, it is probably the highest in the country. You cannot separate a utility bill from a rent or mortgage bill. They go together. So when you combine those, California has very high cost of living.
And California is pretty famous for pushing toward clean energy production. Is that having an impact or effect on utility rates?
Yes, the clean energy production is having a downward effect on rates. And
Makes
that's
them go up.
because the price of solar and wind has
Gone
come
down.
down so much in the past several years that it's now cheaper than natural gas. So the good news is all the investments we've been making over the years in renewable energy has brought the price down.
Mark Tony is executive director of the San Francisco-based consumer advocacy group TURN, or the Utility Reform
The issue
Network.
is
Thanks for
people
joining
just
us.
don't
Thank you
fucking
very much.
advocate
Appreciate
and
it.
put up
BeeHive
installations
is
on
the largest
themselves,
utility company
make
in
their own
the United
community
States,
solar
serving
farms,
about 16 million people throughout a
provide
70,000 square mile service area from Bakersfield and the
for
north side of
themselves
Santa
and other
Barbara County
communities or
to
part of
near
the
the
grid
state line with Oregon
to
and
offset
Nevada.
things.
We're on Facebook as Cap Radio, and you can follow us on Twitter at Cap Radio News.
Support for NPR comes from this station.
That would have been my dream, but there's so many regulations here that I can only do it on the property. New entrance to the driveway. There's those huge, two big, huge, beautiful trees. Move this out the way. Dig a 40-foot pond. I had a gravel dump right here. I'm gonna move Casey forward. Move this out the way. Make a road down. Road this way. Clean everything up where it just look like this. And when you go past, it'll be all open up. Dig a trench. See if it fills up. It fills up. We're putting a pond right here. Have a nice swing coming off. Yeah. Farm. Do 3 cabins, 4 tent site campings for hip camp and healing. We got the rock to do right there, and now we're gonna turn it into a pond. The driveway's gonna go this way. Make a road go down there. Clean up all this. Get it looking all nice. Fire resistant. Same with that side. Clean all this out. That's the 2 of us. Getting it done. Love you, kids. Love you, world. Happy 1st of the month. Backhoe lifted up out the way. We're gonna meet the dump truck. I always thought this hole and the other small hole was fucking because of rain. Now it ain't rain, and it ain't gonna rain for about 2.5 weeks it'll be, and the water's still here. And another time of not no water, somebody's been down the road before. That's why inshallah we're gonna dig that out. We're gonna have a pond that's gonna fill itself. Healing water, man, at the mine. Water that we drink. We're gonna be spewing out that. What is this? Gold mine water. 2,000 feet in the ground.